All right, we're up and running. I think we're up and running.
Yes, sir.
All right, today what we're going to be talking about is the battle for the male mind. And what do we mean by this? Well, quite obviously, there's been something of a, we'll call it a discussion going on about the concept of masculinity. What does it actually mean? And there's been a lot of people weighing into this debate. In fact, the Washington Post recently put out an article where they were talking about how the right is the only one offering any answers for men, and that needs to change. Well, we're going to argue today that no, the right is not the only one offering answers for men. The left has too. It's just that most men don't want it. And so they're looking for an alternative. And we're going to talk about two prominent figures today. We're also going to mention some other people that fall within these various spaces. And what the whole purpose of today's discussion is to look at the various answers that are being given to men to deal with the sort of things that are going on within our culture, within society as a whole, and to answer, are the options they're being given sufficient, or is there actually a third way that we need to be able to consider, go through, and analyze? All that and more coming up on this episode of Making the Argument.
We can see that the live stream chat is already fairly lively, so if you would like to continue this conversation after the show, you can head down to the link in the description and join our Circle chat. We have some great conversations there. We get a lot of our episode ideas from our members in Circle, and so if you have any ideas, we would love to get to know you there and hear them as well.
All right. As always, I'm your host, Nick Freitas, member of the Virginia House of Delegates, but other than that, a reasonably good guy. And for the purposes of the conversation today, also a husband and father, since we'll be talking a little bit about all that good stuff.
He's not too shabby.
With me, she hasn't traded me in yet. With me, as always, my beautiful bride, Tina, queen of the bees.
Hey, speaking of the bees, you guys, I did a harvest the other day, and I'm super excited. I brought some honey over to the boys so they can have some. And
thank you very much.
Yeah. Like
75 pounds of honey.
No, 72.
72
pounds of
all
honey.
right.
But that actually is a lot less honey than you might think it is. It's 1 5-gallon bucket plus another gallon in another bucket. So it's really not that much honey.
It's awesome. It's
But I also went out and see, I'm getting my trad wife thing going. Like Nick was traveling for work, so I did all this like traditional wifing. I went and picked blackberries in the bushes down by our woods, and I even brought the boys blackberry jelly. See, look at that.
Yeah.
So here we go.
Good job. Trad wifing it up.
I'm trying.
And then, of course, now sporting the new do, and I'm going to be honest, I like it. It's good. It's good. Our resident historian and political prognosticator, Christian Hines.
I'm bald.
Dude, it's good, man. You got the. I like it, man. It's Viking. He needs an axe behind him on the wall.
I mean, I'm going bald, so I may as well just. I don't know. I'm not yet a college professor, so I don't want the college professor look where you've got the bald top, but you still have the hair on the sides.
If you ever get one of those jackets with the little things on the elbows, dude, we're done, man. We're not friends anymore. And then, of course, we have producer of producers, Nick Hamilton, the good Hamilton, the one that doesn't like central banking.
Nick, I think our folks are pretty excited for this chat.
We'll see. The chat is already getting lively.
I already saw somebody condemning you for supporting Andrew Tate, even though you never even said whether you could support him.
Haven't even said anything yet.
I support him. Condemn me.
Yeah.
No.
All right. So here's what we're going to talk about, right? So I already said a little bit in the beginning there, this whole debate over masculinity, and I would say the debate over the male mind. And there's been a couple of figures that have been pretty prominent in this. And I almost think that we're starting to see kind of schools of thought on this developing. And I would say that one school of thought kind of goes with the, Andrew and Tristan Tate. You could probably, put Justin Waller, and there's a lot of other guys too that would go into this category of kind of their version of masculinity. And it's interesting because there's so many people that immediately either one way or the other just have made a decision on Tate. Either this guy's awesome and he should be leading, or he's a horrible misogynist and probably a criminal. Like that seems to be it. And it's interesting because depending on what clip you see, you might have a very, very different reaction to what Andrew or Tristan Tate is saying. And so we're actually going to go through and we're going to analyze this today. So this is what I want everybody to be thinking about. What we're actually doing is we're trying to analyze what are these guys saying and why. And yeah, some of it's flippant and some of it's, you could call it over the top or whatever it is, but why are they saying it and who's listening? This is really, really important. Who's listening? The other guy we're going to talk a lot about today is Jordan Peterson. Because I would argue that another kind of school of thought with respect to masculinity is coming up around Jordan, and I have a lot of respect for Jordan Peterson, a lot of respect for the work that he does. But again, I think you could say that there are things that Tate says that appeals to men in a way that Peterson doesn't, and there's things that Peters say that appeal to men in a way that doesn't appeal or doesn't address other issues that maybe Tristan and Andrew are bringing up. And then another thing that we're going to discuss as we go through this process is we're going to ask, okay, are either one of these sufficient? Does one of them have the answer? Does the other one have the answer? Is it a combination of the two? Is there anything missing? And that, I think, is going to be a very interesting discussion. But before we get to all of that, let's talk a little bit about what is going on right now. Like, what version of masculinity is being offered up within the larger culture and society as a whole, right? Because the reason why Andrew Tate and Peterson just exploded onto the scene was because it was a reaction. It was a reaction to what's been going on now for quite some time, and the prevailing societal and cultural wisdom, at least in the West, with respect to what a man is supposed to be. And both of them in their own way, and it's very, very unique and very different backgrounds, both of them have basically stood up to this and said, no, this is wrong. This is wrong. This is not representative of what masculinity is, and this is not how men are supposed to behave, and this is not what we're supposed to be. And they've gotten a lot of pushback, whether it's from like fourth wave feminism, but it's almost always predominantly, almost, not always, but almost from the left. So let's look at this compilation that we found of this, various clips of people talking to people predominantly on the left about what they think about masculinity, right? Because like I said, there was a Washington Post article that said the right is the only one giving answers to men, and that needs to change, which is, again, presumably to say that, well, the left needs to come up with their, I would argue the left already has. The left already has. So let's go ahead and watch this first clip.
Of boys in their little muscle shirts.
Men are not meant to be dominant. Men are meant to be submissive.
Life's too short to exercise. I'm just gonna be honest. There are so many better things to do than exercise.
It's about when you do that and there's like muscles there, nobody cares about that.
It hurts me to see how corrupted you are.
Oh my gosh.
And can cry. So it's okay to be weak.
It is okay to be fat.
If you work out strictly for appearance-based reasons, you are fat phobic.
All right, pause right there. There's more, but we're not going to watch it because it's hard to stomach. But I love this. One of the things I love about this is the whole, if you work out strictly for appearances, right, which you shouldn't just work out for appearances, but that ain't a bad reason, right? If it gets you into the gym, fine.
Yeah.
But this whole idea, like, you're fat phobic. I've noticed that whenever somebody in this new version of culture has any sort of pushback, they came up with a phobia that represents any sort of pushback to their ideology or to their policy positions. Just so everyone's clear, just so we define our terms here, phobia is an irrational fear or hatred of something, right? That's generally associated with phobia. And I love it whenever I hear this, oh, you're fat phobic, you're transphobic. I always like, no, I'm not scared. Believe me, I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid of anybody in that little reel that we just watched. Yeah. I fear none of them. I also hate none of them. I don't hate any of them. I may despise the ideology that they're pushing because I think it's bad for them, along with everybody else that adopts it. And I don't see a lot of people on there that you would probably determine as, oh yeah, these seem like really, really happy, well-adjusted, healthy people. I don't see a lot of that. Now, inevitably somebody say, well, that's a caricature of what we believe. Okay.
Nick,
That's not true.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
What are one of the natural consequences of working out daily, 5 times a day, lifting weights for men?
What, 5 times a day? That would be really
5
good.
times a week. Yeah, that'd be a bit much.
I mean, one, it's going to be. It's first of all, it's
Depends
good
on
for
if
both.
you're vaccinated. If you're vaccinated, death. I'm just kidding. I'm kidding.
Oh my gosh!
And that's when YouTube canceled it. No. So it's good for both men and women.
Yeah.
But obviously, it's good for you from a testosterone standpoint. It's good for you just with respect to your overall health, your overall strength. For women, it's really, really good, especially as they're getting older too, on things like bone density. There's just 1,000 different reasons to consistently work out, both from a weightlifting perspective as well as doing some cardio and things like that. It's just healthier. It's just better for you overall.
Well,
I would also argue that from just a mental health standpoint, it's incredibly important. If you are sitting around sedentary and you're not doing, and I want to just say the gym, right? one of the things I try to do is not just go to the gym. I also try to do physical labor outside around the house, which is fairly easy for us because gardens, animals, and everything else to take care of. But there's something about being out in the sun. Obviously not. Everything can be overexposed.
Well, you need the vitamin D.
Yeah.
But I noticed a really big difference when you had a job at one point that was just very mentally taxing, but not very physically taxing. It was after the military. And you had to commute into like Tyson's Corner or whatever. And there just wasn't a lot of physical labor involved in anything you had to do, but you were exhausted mentally. And I remember you having like insomnia during that because you could not, because your body had never done anything strenuous in the day. Your body wasn't really tired. Your brain was. And so you would just stay awake and your brain would run because your body's still giving it all these chemicals, like it should be awake.
No, I'll tell you what, I don't think there's anything better that I like to start off the morning with a workout because when you do that, I think it just kickstarts your day in the right way. It kickstarts your metabolism. And then toward the end of the day, some people like to work out in the evenings. I don't like working out in the evenings. I'll do it if I have to, but I like coming home and again, doing some sort of physical labor. It doesn't have to be like, horribly difficult or anything like that, but something, because there is nothing better about going to bed at the end of the day, tired, with a sense of accomplishment that you actually achieve things. But
the point I was making is that doing hard things breeds confidence. And isn't it ironic that these people that obviously don't have a lot of confidence don't want anyone else to have it either?
I don't know. They seem to be really, really confident in their ideology, but it's almost this idea of like herd mentality that as long as we all think the wrong thing together, then we're the good guys, right? We're morally justified.
I feel like it's an overcorrect. I think that we went through a period where, it wasn't healthy to be overweight and all of that, but you did have people that were pretty vicious about teasing or berating people who were overweight or being just like overly disgusted by them. I remember witnessing it, when I was young with an aunt of mine. And so it is weird when you like, it's an overcorrect. I think there's a proper way to treat other human beings, no matter their weight or physical appearance. And I think this is like an answer to the people that were mean. It's like, oh, well, you were mean to me, so I'm going to overcorrect and just lean into being obese.
Yeah.
And it's just, and I think that overcorrection is going to kind of be a little bit of a theme as we talk about some of these other things as well.
Well, I got a question here from Reminder. He says, Nick Freitas, not hating these individuals is hard. I know some of it comes from belief in the gospel of Jesus Christ, but what else do you use to help you not to hate? So again, I think it's really important. Again, my faith is important to me, and that dictates a lot of this, but I do think it's important to distinguish between an individual and a belief system. You can have all kinds of, you can despise a particular belief system, but when you start to see people as being captured by that belief system, as opposed to just the absolute personification of it, I think that really helps. It especially helps too when you meet someone that has gone through some things, and you start to understand that the reason why they believe a certain way is because of some sort of trauma or thing that they've experienced, and then when they get through that, they end up being the people with just some of the greatest stories and life examples that they can provide people. And I mean, that's how I do it. But what were you gonna say, Christian?
I was gonna say that this clip that we just saw here is obviously a caricature, but like that is what the left is offering. We've got another one that we're about to play in a second, but like the message is basically we want you to be fat and weak and submissive. And for a lot of men who fell into that hole, somebody like, their whole lives. Like, for example, there's a clip that we didn't get, we weren't able to put into this show, but I was watching the Whatever podcast, and there was this guy who was like, I'm 23, but I remember when I was in elementary school, we would have all these people that would show up and be like, it's okay for men to cry. You need to be emotionally available. I think that's a phrase that we used in an older podcast. And then the second that somebody like Andrew Tate or Jordan Peterson comes along, men in my age group just immediately gravitate towards them. And there's a reason why. I think it's because even though we've played like a caricature in some ways of what the left is offering, that is what they're offering. Well, it's just an extreme version of what we played and what we're about to play. And men are rejecting that message overwhelmingly. The second that there's an alternative message that comes along, they immediately gravitate towards that, which is, by the way, why Peterson and Tate, I mean, the left is trying to completely and utterly destroy them. I said at the very beginning of the podcast, I'll defend Andrew Tate. I'm a fan. I'm actually more of a fan of Jordan Peterson.
Yeah.
Because I'm more in the academic philosophical realm, and that's exactly where he is.
Yeah, well, I think the other thing that's interesting is when Peterson does show a little bit more emotion, right? He's a little bit older. He's his child has grown, been married, the whole deal. So let me ask you a question. When he shows a little bit of emotion, does the left immediately rush in and go, "Oh gosh, what a great guy. He's really showing some emotion there. He's really being emotionally available. He's being vulnerable." Do they do that? No, they mock him for it. They mock him for it.
That's the left. But like right now we're talking about like the battle for men's minds. And I'll just tell you from a female perspective, like when a man, I'm not talking about these soy boys that are out there blubbering all over the internet, over every stupid little thing and guys that get all weepy over a girl, or whatever. I'm talking about men who have something that is deeply affecting them. Like I'll never forget my father or my dad was worried about me at one point when I was like 17 or something. Yeah. And he got in my car before I was leaving for school, and he basically confronted me and asked me if certain things were going on, which they were not. But I was being very quiet about things, and so he was worried. And he showed emotion. Like he teared up because he was worried that something specific was happening that wasn't. Anyway, the point is that all my walls came down when I saw my dad show that love and that emotion for me. Mm-hmm. So I think there's an appropriate place for that, and then there's an inappropriate place for it.
I don't disagree with that at all. What I will say is that I just find it interesting that the same people are screaming that men need to be more emotionally available when a man on the right, who is generally considered a masculine man, does show a degree of vulnerability. They don't see it as a positive manifestation. They attack it and they call him weak, and it's just amazing to me that it's like I don't buy what you're pitching.
Well, just even look at how the left treated Trump when they would talk about him being fat. They would go on and on about Trump being fat, but then on the other side,
it's incredibly fatphobic of them to do that.
Exactly. Yeah. Out of the other side of their mouth, they're talking about how being fat is beautiful and it's okay.
Let's talk about let's show one more of these, which was in her. This was a clip from the Whatever podcast. She's a feminist, and go ahead.
Men are just more likely to be violent. They're just more likely to be violent. I know that they can't stop killing each other, but they also can't stop killing women. The problem is violence is a male problem.
Violence is a
forced castration and feminization for all men.
The truth comes out. I knew it. See, there it is. There it is. You talk to a feminist long enough, and the truth comes out. There's like a very notable feminist who like wrote books and shit, and she was like, we need to cull the male population to like 10% of what it currently is.
Yeah, I'm in those spaces. The Abort Male Babies Initiative. I don't believe in that. At least publicly. I don't believe in that publicly.
All right, go ahead.
I don't believe in that publicly. That's what the left saw.
Well, there's not
Che
a whole lot.
There's
not a whole lot more public than getting on the Whatever podcast and saying it.
Che Guevara over there is going to be like, what men need is forced castration and feminization. Yeah. That's an extreme way to describe it, but you want to talk about psychological, like that is what the left is offering mentally to men, is emasculating them and feminizing them.
It is. And the crazy part of that is, Christian, is that if you look at like all the various serial killers, they almost always have trauma inflicted on them from a mother who emasculated them.
No, well, we've said this before. Emasculated men are not weak. What we consider weak emasculated men are not safe men.
No,
they're just dangerous. The difference is that they're not dangerous to me.
They become
they're dangerous to society. They're dangerous to women.
Exactly.
They're dangerous to women, right?
Because there's going to be that urge to make a woman pay for the woman that hurt them. Yeah. It's just, especially if he's been emasculated by a mother.
So here's the reason why we showed two of those. And again, everybody can say those are extreme examples, but I would say that there's an underlying theme, and we could have showed more. Like, it's not like we didn't have more to show here. We could have. But there's this underlying theme that, again, those concepts associated with traditional masculinity are bad and mean and toxic and responsible for, what a horrible civilization we live in. I always love people like, oh, we live in this horrible, horrible patriarchy. Like, compared to what? Like, compared to what? What in the West is
compared
so
to the
terrible?
state of nature, Nick.
Yeah, no, I love these people. Again, someone like her that is essentially, men are the problem to everything. It's like, well, I got a question. Why haven't you set up a matriarchy? Like, if men are worthless and men are just, women are just superior in every single component, how come you haven't set up? How come in all of recorded human history, there's never been a significant, I'm not talking about tribes here and there, I'm talking about a major matriarchal power on world society? How come? Why is it that in the West, which you claim is this horrible patriarchal society, that happens to be the area where women have the most rights, the most freedom, the most upward progression within social, economic, and political spheres? And my question when I look at someone like her is like, when are you ever going to be satisfied? Because I will tell you this much, if it really is the abort male babies initiative, it's the cold 10% or the male population down to 10%, good luck pulling that off, because I don't think we're going to go for it. And it's the sort of backlash to that sort of attitude that you're starting to see with more young men. And that leads us into the next part that we're going to talk about, because the Tate, whether you like them or you hate them, young men are listening to them. And so what we're going to do is we're going to hear some of the things that they have to say
and try to figure out why they're listening.
Why are they listening? So let's go ahead and look at this first one.
If you look at anything that builds a man into a man, there's a degree of suffering. It's very hard to become a man and have a man who's respected and has stories and is capable when he only had a nice life and nice experiences. It's usually the things that made you the best version of you are usually the worst things that happened to you. So the demons I carry from jail, the fact that I can't sleep, the fact that I can't sleep, I've had girls say to me, you can't sleep, you need to see a psychiatrist. And I said, absolutely not. I would be furious if a psychiatrist walked in here and took my demons from me. I don't care if they could fix me with a click, they're mine. And they were bestowed to me by God. And they are mine to deal with, and they are mine to fix, because that's how I become a better version of me. I would be furious if someone took them away from me.
Okay, pause. All right, now when we watched this earlier, Tina, honestly, what was your first reaction to that?
Okay, so I have a real problem with his use of language in this. I understand the concept of struggle refining you into something stronger. The problem I have with Andrew Tate sometimes is that he's not very precise in his language. And so he labels something demons, and so everything he says after saying, these are my demons, blah, 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 no one can take them from me. These were given to me by God. Everything in me as a Christian woman, I look at that and go, well, you must not believe that demons are real, that really exist. Otherwise you wouldn't use the word demon to describe your struggles. And so, because he used that word, everything he said after that, I'm looking at from a theological standpoint. Yeah. And I know God does not give you demons, and demons aren't things that you hold on to and want to keep and nurture and protect. Yeah. These are things you do want to get rid of if it's really a demon. So he doesn't mean actual demons. Yeah. He means his life struggles, the things he went through and the struggles that he has because of his experiences. He doesn't actually mean demons. So my problem with that all stemmed from the fact that he used the word demon.
No, I get it. It was funny because when we first watched it, again, we kind of watched it together, and Tina was like, oh, like she was upset about it. And again, she was upset because of the lack of precise language.
I said it was BS.
Yeah. And
every guy on this table.
I said, Tina, I will tell you right now, every guy at this table understood what he was saying and why.
Well, I understood the rest of what he said.
No, I get it. But let me finish. Finish. The wording, I get it. I'm fine with the thing on the wording. And this is actually one of the big differences between kind of the Tate approach and the Peterson approach. Peterson is very precise in his wording. We're going to kind of get to that later. But one of the things he talks about there with the whole struggling with the suffering and everything else is that I think there are a lot of young men that are looking for something that's going to give them meaning and purpose. I saw this one clip where somebody said, he goes, one of the biggest problems that we have with treating male depression is that we treat it like female depression, and that we tell men that they're accepted and they're loved and they're cherished and they're appreciated. He goes, when really what men want is a meaning and a purpose. They want to feel strong. They want to feel capable. They want to feel like, he goes, you give a man meaning and purpose. With the confidence that he feels that he can meet that purpose, he'll crawl through broken glass with a smile on his face. And there is so much truth to that. And again, if people want to understand, and I would argue specifically, if women want to understand why when young men see what Andrew Tate says right there and think, I get that. It's because we do. We want to be. I can remember I was speaking at actually I think it was at a Memorial Day service. And I'm sitting there and I got this group of veterans out there, right? And we've got veterans from Korean War, from Vietnam, from Desert Storm, from obviously recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and everywhere else. And I got up and I said to them, I got to tell you this much. I don't care what academia thinks of my service. I don't care what politicians think of my service. I sure as heck don't care what the media thinks of my service. I said, but I do care what the men and women in this audience who went before me think about my service. Right? Because I grew up with that. I grew up listening to my dad talking about being a homicide detective in LAPD. I grew up listening to my grandfather talking about joining the Navy at 16 during World War II. Right? I grew up listening to these stories of men that were called to a purpose who went into danger and protected the things that they loved. Right? That they valued those things more. And the struggles that came with that and the injuries that came with that and everything else were significant to their development of the sort of people that they became and the sort of people that I looked up to. And this is what he's talking about. And men, I'm like, we key into that. Like all the other stuff that he's saying, he could have said that better. That wasn't as precise. We're keying into that sense of purpose that he's talking about here.
Yeah, I think that's one of the problems is that in sometimes the way different people perceive things differently, and we look at things through a different lens based on our worldview. And so that is probably the issue, is why I got hung up on. I basically threw out most of what he said because I got hung up on the semantics, which I shouldn't have done. I should have stayed more open-minded and understood that, well, he really meant this. I just, I think if you're putting things out there to encourage other people and to get people to emulate you, which is what he's doing, you should be a little bit more careful in language, and I think Jordan Peterson does a better job.
Sure. All right, let's look at this next one. Is Justin Waller again? I'm kind of putting him into
this guy's
similar,
a character,
similar group.
He falls under the Tate category. Yeah.
A lot of men are bombs and a lot of men are shit. If there was a society where only the men that truly produce and could truly take care of a family could reproduce, you would watch men's production skyrocket through the roof. Because I hate to say it, men get up out of bed every morning, whether they're a bricklayer, an inventor, or they're trying to make a rocket ship to the moon. It is in pursuit of women. They say a lot of.
Yeah. This is, I can't remember who was it said that, and again, you don't got to like this term, but I thought it was interesting. And it was, what was it? Men civilize the wild and women civilize men. And
there's some truth to that.
I have a hard time listening to anything this guy says because he's such a douchebag.
What made me bad about it, and again, if you listen to Justin Waller and where he came from and part of his story and things like that, it's very interesting. Where I was very, very disappointed in him was the way he treated Lila Rose on the Whatever podcast, because he talks everything he just said there
is true.
True. It is true. If you want to motivate a man like nothing else, give him a woman that he loves, and he will spend his life slaying dragons for her. I mean, he will, and that's a positive thing. That's also a very, very powerful thing. The problem is that Lila Rose brought up that Justin Waller also said, "Well, I'm not a one woman man. I never will be. Like, it's just not how I'm wired." And Lila goes, "Well, wait a second. You keep telling everyone about it, the importance of discipline and courage and responsibility and doing all these other things. And you tell these other women that, they're making decisions that are going to be detrimental for them. Why don't you apply that same discipline to this aspect of your life?" And instead of saying, "Lila, that's a good point," no, it was, "Well, I think you're annoying. This little goody two shoes." And I'm like, why are you trying to intimidate her right now?
Yeah, she's basically exactly what he says every guy wants.
Yes. Well, not only that, but the thing that made me mad about Justin Waller saying that is all these guys that are like, "Hey, if you want to be a high value woman, you can't go out there and have this huge body count. You can't do those." Okay, how does a woman get a huge body count? By sleeping with dudes like you.
It's people like him that are contributing to the dating crisis and the crisis of masculinity in general. This is something we brought up in, I think, December when we did our 3-part series on, issues within relationships and marriage. And then we did a crisis with men. And then we also did a final third episode focused on women. And the dating market for somebody like Hamilton and I's age, or anybody younger than us, is just a catastrophe right now. It's like 80% of women are throwing themselves at 20% of men. And it's people like him that are contributing to this because he's sleeping around with 15, 20 women, and they're all these women are sharing the same men, and then they're like, where are all the good men? Well, you friend zoned a lot of them, first off, but second off, you keep sleeping around with 5, 10, 15, 20 guys. Eventually you get to a point where, this is going to sound really mean, but eventually you're going to get to a point where you're damaged goods.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. That's the truth. And people don't like to hear that. And a lot of the response I will see from women on these shows is they'll be like, well, men do it. And I'm like, that doesn't mean they should.
No, right. It's a small number of men that are contributing to the problem, but it's also a huge number of women that are also contributing to the problem. And it's Ralph England in the comments actually said just a few minutes ago, he said something along the lines of, it breaks my heart to see so many young men gravitate towards the message of, role models of people like Andrew Tate or Justin Waller. That's kind of the focus of this podcast because there's a reason that is happening. And Rolf, I actually to some degree agree with you on that I said at the very beginning of the show, I'll defend Andrew Tate. I'm a huge fan. I'm a huge fan of some of the things that he says. I'm not necessarily a huge fan of what he does. His background, his business background is very shady. I mean, he started a whole cam girl business. Obviously, I don't condone that. And also, there's a lot that he says that I do disagree with. But there's two components of that. You can disagree with a lot of what he says and does, but you can also understand and to some degree appreciate why so many young men have gravitated towards the message of people like him. You will not solve the crisis of masculinity, and especially with young men, until you understand why so many young men almost wholeheartedly agree with the message that he's giving.
Yeah.
There's a reason why.
Let's look at this next clip. This is another one with Justin.
Beta males.
I think one of the most beautiful things about love is being able to fully take care of a woman.
Batman. I already don't like him.
Every fairy tale that was ever written for all of time was about a man saving a woman from a castle in a dragon den. I think that's absolutely beautiful, and I have nothing against women being empowered. I do feel like the happiest women in the world are the ones that look up to a man and that he can fight every day to love her and love his kids and his family and provide.
That's a fact. Damn it.
All right,
He's
pause.
actually smart.
Yeah, that's true. The problem is like, okay, but Justin, you got to live up to that too. It's not good enough. It's not good enough to say all these things as a theory. And then when someone like Lila Rose says, okay, well then Justin, why can't you do that? Well, I'm just not wired that way. Oh, okay, well, great. If you looked across at the table at the club girls that you're talking to on the whatever podcast, and they just said, well, Justin, I'm just not wired that way. You'd say, well, that's no excuse.
Exactly.
That doesn't change the dynamic.
He has a different standard for himself. And that's the crazy part is I saw an interview with him where he was talking about, he likes to support his friends who are family men and them to, help them become the best men they can be and blah, blah, blah. And I look at that from a woman's perspective who has a healthy marriage with a very manly man. I look at that and go, I would never want my husband to be friends with you. Yeah. You go to extremes to get women, you discard women. The way that you treat women is not with respect, yet you expect respect on the other side. And that is not the type of man I would ever want pouring into my husband. So it's like, please, I'm glad you want to help, but please don't. Yeah. Please don't.
Let's look. Okay, so now we're gonna go back to Andrew Tate here. All right, let's go and watch this one.
To a story I've never told before. I was staying at my friend's house. We were playing Nintendo. We were about to go to bed. My friend was called Ryan, I remember, and Ryan started screaming at his mom, Mom, nightlight. So she puts on this nightlight. And I was like, wow, a nightlight, that's a thing. And I was like, what's that? He goes, it's a nightlight because I'm scared of the dark. I must have only been about 5. I was like, all right, cool. I remember going home to my dad and saying, hey, Dad, can I have a nightlight? He's like, no. But I was scared of the dark. And I remember he was playing chess. If you looked at me, it was nighttime. He took my ass up to my bedroom, walked me in the bedroom in the dark, said, there's monsters in there, son. Good luck. See you tomorrow. And I'd never been scared of the dark before. My friend had a nightlight. Now I want a nightlight. Now I'm scared of the dark. Screamed and cried an hour and a half before I fell asleep. Guess what? I never asked for a nightlight again.
I just apologize for how loud the music is for that.
Yeah, the music ruined it, but it's actually really funny.
If anybody couldn't hear what Andrew Tate was saying there, he was saying that when he grew up, he was over at a friend's house. They were playing Nintendo. He was a young kid. His kid had a nightlight, right? Or his friend had a nightlight. So he goes home and he's playing chess with his dad or whatnot, and he asks and remember his dad was like a chess grand champion, so he's been playing chess since he was like 4. And he goes, hey, Dad, can I have a nightlight? Why do you need a nightlight? I'm scared of the dark. He took Andrew Tate upstairs, put him in that room, locked the door and said, well, there's monsters in there. Have a good night. Now, I mean, most people today especially would look at that and be like, that is horrible. That's horrific. Like, I can't believe you do something like that. Does he sound like he's talking about this as like a horrible piece of childhood trauma that he's never gotten over? Or does he actually talk about it as something that he actually appreciates now as a formative component when he was young? Now, you can disagree with that. You can disagree with that, but I'm listening to the way that he describes it. And again, this is one of the things that I think when you have, especially an education system that is largely dominated by the feminine, right? And it's not I mean, obviously I believe that women should be heavily involved in education and the upbringing of children. I totally believe that. But it's also this idea that things like this sort of what some people might describe as traumatic, wasn't something that necessarily adversely affected him in this case. It was actually something he saw as formative, because it proved a point to him that needed to be proved. His dad could have said, yes, here's a nightlight, and then he could have continued to be afraid of the dark that he'd never been afraid of before. He was afraid of it by association. He wasn't afraid of it because he had any inherent fear of it, right? He could have been just told, oh, no, son, don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. No, he was given a challenge that he had to overcome, and he remembered it. And this goes back to his original statement about the thing as a man is you remember those stories. And all of us, I think men and women both do it, but all of us as men, when we're older, how often do we like to sit around talking about like, oh man, my dad would do this, or oh man, if I did that, I'd get in so much trouble, or my dad would make me do this, or he would make me do that. Like, we look back at those things as formative things that developed us and taught us how to overcome challenges and difficulties in order to prove to ourselves that we could do it. Now, he could have just sat there and affirmed us, but would that have actually convinced us that we could overcome things? See, this is the part where I'm talking about, like, love him or hate him. He is saying stuff that resonates with men because men are tired of being told that that they're dysfunctional girls.
I feel like Tate runs the line of a little bit of an overcorrect, because women have been bashing men for a long time now. And now you've got this idea of like men bashing women and almost viewing every single woman like a club girl. And they're not all club girls. And so I think that I think what a lot of these guys sitting in their mom's basement are seeing on the internet are women who put themselves all over the internet. And so they think all women are like that, when real women are probably avoiding that kind of activity.
Well, I got to say this too. I already got people getting mad at me. Like, I can't believe as a father you're advocating for... Okay.
That's okay. People think I'm trying to control your friends now.
Wait a second. No. This is important. This is important because we always get to this. Everybody is looking for the first chance to say, I disagree with that. You're wrong. You're a bad person now. Try this for just a second. Listen to what we're doing. We're analyzing. Why were these things done? Do I think it was appropriate to lock your kid in his room at night and tell him there was monsters in there? Not something I ever did to my own children. So just calm down a second. What I'm pointing out is the way that he's describing that story is not from a position of fear or trauma. He looked at it as a positive memory of his father teaching him to overcome something. And if you want to properly understand the way some men interpret some of these things and why they're looking at Andrew and Tristan and going, man, that's awesome. That's cool. It's because it seems like they're becoming stronger. They're recognizing their power. Right? So just understand what it is that we're doing right now. I'm not advocating that you follow the Andrew Tate version of raising children.
The whole point of...
I'm saying understand why this is resonating on some level, even if you don't agree with it in its entirety.
Yes. Tigris actually wrote in the comments a few minutes ago, who commits the most crimes? Who overthrows governments and revolutions? Young men. If young men feel they don't have a future, that includes a family, then they will feel apart from society. I think, well, first off, there's tons of proof with that. It reminds me of the whole right-wing backlash episode that we did a month ago. That what we're trying to do here is understand why is the message of somebody like Andrew Tate so captivating to young men. There's a reason why. And in fact, actually... Could we actually go back to the previous clip? Because I think that this clip of this woman asking this random guy on the street in London, what are your thoughts about Andrew Tate, really encapsulates the feelings of so many 20-something-year-old men right now.
be to Andrew Tate?
Is he gonna see this? Yeah. Really? Okay, cool. So to Andrew Tate, I say that you should continue doing what you're doing because you're putting out a message that most people in today's world try to ignore. I really appreciate you, mate, and keep doing what you're doing. Don't give up.
What would your message?
Pause.
I mean, that encapsulates what 20-something-year-old men feel when they listen to him, overwhelmingly. And for all the people in the comments that are like, only weak men listen to Andrew Tate. No, only weak men go out there and say things like, men are supposed to be submissive with their long fingernails and bony, skinny arms, or fat asses that are like complaining on the internet about patriarchy. And like, those are the weak men. Now, you could say that dangerous men, in a bad way, dangerous men, I don't mean in a good way, Jordan Peterson way, but you could say that dangerous men, the men that will potentially overthrow the American Republic one day, those are the ones that are captivated to Tate. And you know what? If you agree with me that maybe we should try to preserve our constitutional system and not fall into a right-wing authoritarian system of government, then maybe we should figure out why so many young men are being drawn to him rather than attacking young men for being drawn to him.
Oh, I find nothing more fascinating than the people that Tate's horrible, Tate's horrible, Tate's horrible. Like, I got a question. Since you're on the side that have either given men no option or you've given this other be submissive, be more feminine, be more... clearly they're not listening to you. You trashing Tate makes Tate more popular for them. So if you really are concerned about that, what you would actually take some time to do is understand why the message resonates. You would understand that. If you cared about actually changing something. Let's look at the next one. I think this next one's Tristan.
My kids are 13, 14. They'll be doing security. No. Tonight, you're not sleeping in this giant house. No, you're working tonight. I'm going to give you £10. Stand here. There are full-grown men doing this job, and I respect everyone who works for me. But you want to live in this house and you think you're too good? No. You're going to go and you're working security tonight. If you see anything, press this button. This is your job. Here's your baton. When they get their driving license, good. You're driving me around all day. Oh, well, you want to use the driver, but you think you're too good to be a driver yourself. Anyone who works for me, my kids are filling those work roles as well. My kids are 13, 14.
The left is going to be like, Tristan Tate is using child labor.
There's somebody that was asking, basically what are his more controversial opinions and things like that.
Oh, we got some coming up.
And there might be some, but some of the ones that bother me the most, one of the reasons, so I struggle just personally when somebody says a lot of really correct things, a lot of really good things, but then they're so wrong in another area, and it almost causes me not to respect them enough to listen to them for the in the good areas. Yeah. And that's just it. Is everybody is flawed and nobody's perfect. But I've seen a few clips of Andrew Tate where he talks about like we're
going to get into
basically having just sex with random women and like literally discarding them and icing them out afterwards as a lesson. And I am telling you, after listening to him talk about that, it's a real struggle for me to hear anything positive he has to say. But the problem is that I worry about young people who are super impressionable taking all the good that he's saying, which is legit, and then also taking in this other stuff, which is really actually counter to some of the things that he espouses. I mean, he kind of contradicts himself in some ways. And that's what worries me about his influence is he gets it really, really right in some areas and then really, really wrong in other areas.
No, and we've got some clips that we're going to show that again. All right, so let's.
I think that's the reason why we're doing this episode.
Yeah, it is. It's because we're trying to analyze what is the message, who's the messenger, what is the message, why does it resonate, who does it resonate with, and is there something? Is it sufficient or is it insufficient? Right. All right. So let's go ahead and that last one. Okay, that last one by Tristan. Here's another reason. If you want to understand another reason why Andrew and Tristan resonate with people, if you don't know their backstory, they grew up poor. I mean, super poor, and they built themselves up. They fought. They became kickboxing champions, and now they're super wealthy. Not just because of the kickboxing, but a bunch of other enterprises they do. And again, enterprises I completely disagree with, don't approve of the whole deal. But one of the things they're adamant about with their own children is you're not going to sit around here and treat the people that work for us like they're just the hired help, and you're going to work too. It doesn't matter that daddy's got millions upon millions of dollars. You're working. You're going to do it because it's a part of growing up. It's a part of like actually learning respect. And you're not going to think you're better than other people because your parents got money. And again, that is the sort of thing that resonates, that demonstrates to the people, these guys remember where they came from. They remember where they came from, and they don't look down on people simply because they don't have as much money as them. All right, let's look at this, another one.
Had a conversation about 2 weeks before I was arrested. And I was sitting with Tristan in Dubai, and we're in this beautiful $40 million mansion, and we have Bugatti outside, McLaren outside. Business is going well. Tristan turns up, he comes in the house, and the waiters are bringing us drinks, and we're smoking shisha and $500 cigar. I'm sitting there, and I said, Tristan, everything's perfect. He goes, yeah, I know. I said, we're fucked. He goes, why? What do you mean? Life doesn't go this way, Tristan. There's no way at 36 I could have just made it, and it's fine. Something's gonna come. I didn't expect to get hit with this. Human trafficking, it's an insane charge. Me and my brother.
All right, so this is...
After watching that video, do you want to know what I said when we previewed the video?
No.
I said, I feel like Andrew Tate's always waving his dick around. Oh. I'm sorry, I said it. I feel like he is always just pulling it out and measuring it up with everybody else. And it's just kind of grating. Anyway, sorry guys, that was a little vulgar, but that's like what I feel like
most
he's
guys would
doing.
not say that though. Because
no, I mean he's definitely cocky.
And he's cocky. Yeah.
But again, part of that too is I think is he remembers what it was like to have nothing, and now he has a lot of stuff, and he's saying this is how I got the stuff, and I earned this stuff, and this is my stuff, and isn't it cool that I have this stuff, and you can have this stuff too if you're doing this. I mean that's part of his deal.
But my point is that men compete with each other. Here's an example. Nick, you could kill me with your bare hands. But when it comes to debates about aspects of history, how often this is part of the reason that we became such good friends was because we both had this shared love of certain topics, and we would debate and argue about it, and we would try to one up each other and oh, look at this neat thing that I know that you don't know. We would compete with each other on that from an intellectual basis. It wasn't, unfortunately, from a physical basis because Nick is just way stronger than me. That's something that's something that will hopefully be changed one day.
That's right.
Once I'm done with this dissertation, I already committed to go into the gym with Nick once I'm done working on my master's, and that will happen, by the way. But no, it's intrinsic within men to want to compete with each other. The difference is that men compete with each other. Here's the positive way that it happens, because we all know the negative way. The negative way is they compete with each other and war breaks out.
Yeah.
You want to find a negative way, I mean, go to Ukraine and you'll find an example of that. But in a positive way, men compete with each other because they want to bring the best out of each other. That's what the whole bro culture is you challenging somebody, a male friend of yours or relative of yours or somebody that you went to school with or somebody that you're friends with. You challenge them to you don't say, oh, you're just beautiful the way that you are. No, instead you say, get off your ass and go out there and make something out of yourself.
Yeah.
I believe in you. You can do these things. And that's how men have been able to build civilizations, by doing that. By challenging each other to not just accept who they are, but to be a better version of who they can be.
Well, and it's also why people will look at the way that men talk to each other a lot of times from the outside. And I've seen a lot of women. In fact, my mother-in-law, when she first saw my father and I interact, she actually took Tina aside and she's like, "Are they okay? Do they have a really problematic relationship?" And Tina's like, "No, they not only do they love each other as father and son, but they're like good friends." This is just, and it's because anytime my dad and I interact, we're constantly teasing each other. We're just constantly, poking fun. Now, there's always going to be moments like when my grandfather passed away. And my grandfather was just so instrumental, obviously in my dad's life, but also in mine. There's going to be those moments where we're grieving over the loss of my grandfather, his dad, and there's real moments in there where the joking goes aside for a minute, but then the joking comes back because that's kind of how that's part of what we're dealing with. In fact, it's funny. Well, we'll get to that later about a Jordan Peterson quote about that. But anyways, this is them kind of predicting that it can't just all be this good at 36, right? So let's go to the next clip.
45 minutes on the phone a day, and I used all of my minutes Tristan never made a single phone call from jail.
Get out of here.
Not one. I was like, Tristan, do you want to speak to anyone? Nah. Sit there watching Romanian news. Didn't give a shit. Bulletproof. He had the superpowers like, bro, I love jail. Jail's great. Look, we got coffee. I love jail. None of my women are messaging me. I love jail. I had 45.
Pause. So, all right. So why do we put this particular clip up there? It's because this is another aspect. This is another aspect of what young men love about Andrew and Tristan Tate. Is that when they had to face adversity, right, which was you getting these charges against them, and they actually got brought into jail. And I don't claim to be a legal expert. From what I could tell of the evidence that was used to do the charges, it seemed a little bit shady. It seemed like they were being targeted. Now, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe they were guilty of some of this stuff, and that would be absolutely
It's possible
horrible.
not. I mean, like you look at their prior history and the type of business they were in and things like that. It's not too far fetched that something like that could have been under the surface. So, I don't think it's one. Basically, we don't have enough information to know for sure.
Yeah. But the point is when they went into jail, right? Andrew was actually more worried. You could tell he's the one that talks about not being able to sleep. He's the one that talks about using all his phone calls. Well, Tristan didn't. And I really believe that, again, what they're also demonstrating at that point, to kind of go to what Christian was saying earlier, is this whole idea of Tristan. That was a moment where Tristan was able to be strong for Andrew, right? And Andrew's the older brother. That was a moment where Tristan was able to be strong for Andrew. And you just see these guys, like how close they are, again, through that adversity. So for a lot of people, a lot of young men, they look at this and they think these guys went into jail kind of predicting it was going to happen. Right. I remember Tate talking about this whole idea. He goes, the only thing I regret is I lost one of my lives. And like, what do you mean? He goes, the first life you lose is when they cancel you. Because for a while they canceled him off of everything. I don't mean they took down his TikTok. I mean, they took down every single social media platform he had. They wouldn't let him use Airbnb. Like he was done. He goes, I used one of my lives. The first thing they do is they try to cancel you. When that doesn't work, the next thing they do is they arrest you. And he said that before he got arrested. He goes, the third thing they do is kill you. He goes, but they did this. And when they came out of jail, so when they went into jail, where they're like, oh gosh, we're so sorry. Nope. When they were in jail, we're like, gosh, darn, we're so sorry. We should. Nope. When they came out of jail, where they're like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Nope. And so for, again, a lot of men, they look at this and they're like, they got attacked. They grew stronger together, and they came out just as defiant as when they went in. And again, when you look at that male urge to stand up to the dragon, right? There's a dragon now, and they're fighting together. And again, it's not just one of them doing it. This is another important component of this that I don't think people recognize, and how important. It's not just Andrew Tate or Tristan Tate. It's the as brothers standing together with each other, you and I against the world. That resonates with people. It resonates with people. All right, let's look at the next one.
There's a lot of people in the chat that think you're an Andrew Tate fan because
we're about to get to.
Oh my gosh! If you just hang on for a little bit, we're going to get to some other things about Andrew Tate, and I will have some other analysis of this. I can't
gets into people's short attention span.
I cannot stress this enough to everyone watching. I'm not sitting here advocating for Andrew Tate or Tristan Tate. We're analyzing who's the messenger, what's the message, who's the recipient, and why are they responding to it?
Why is it resonating with them?
Why is it resonating with them? All right, so
we're eventually going to get to, because we're also going to do this with Jordan Peterson in this episode, and eventually we're going to get to what is missing.
Yeah,
and are there, because there are problems.
Let's
with
just move on.
All right, let's go. Let's do this next one
because we'll get there. We'll get there when we get there.
Tate, crazy morning routine.
I'll come down in the morning, 7 a.m. Andrew's at his laptop. We'll go there's an exercise we hate doing. You put 30 kilograms on a burpee bar. You do a burpee, lift it above your head, and you do it 150 times. It's tiring, it's horrible. So I'll do them and I'll say, Andrew, you're a person. Why haven't you done them yet? Then he'll do them. Then I'll go do them again, just because. I know if I do them, he has to do them. People can see it as two men competing against each other, or you can see it as two men within the same house pushing each other to become stronger.
Andrew. So this goes exactly to what Christian was saying either. Like the version, there's different versions of male competition. And some of them are uniquely and specifically designed to bring out the best in everyone. When you were on an ODA, so when I was in SF, and we went to the range together, the shooting range, oh my gosh, you have never seen so much trash talking in your life by guys that were all very competent at what they were doing with respect to shooting. one of my good buddies, Glenn. Glenn and I were on the same ODA. And when we went overseas, the way Army Special Forces plans their operations is generally what will happen is the captain, the warrant officer, and the team sergeant, they will split it. So 12-man team, right? They'll split up everybody else. So you got a intel sergeant, and then you got a senior Bravo, junior Bravo, that's your weapons guy, senior medic, junior medic, senior commo, junior commo, senior engineer, junior engineer, right? So they split us up, usually into 3 groups. And what they do is they give us criteria. So it's like, okay, hey, group A, this is going to be your infill method. This is going to be your, group B, this is your exfil method. So they give us different criteria, which makes each plan a little bit different based off of the assets that we might have available. And then what we do is we all go off and we plan different strategies for how we're going to hit this objective, how we're going to conduct this raid, how we're going to get this guy. What do we think the threats are going to be on target? How are we going to utilize our indigenous forces, in order to execute this target, right? We do all of that. And then we come back. Now, when you've got guys that have been doing this for a while, here's what you're going to find. There's a lot of similarities in the overall planning structure, right? But there will always be differences, and not just the differences that were given to you by your team leader or your team sergeant or your warrant, right? There'll be little differences with respect to how people think is the best way to hit an objective. Now, will there be significant differences between them? I can say we planned a ton of operations to go get high-value targets. Most of the fundamentals of what we were doing was all pretty similar, but there were some changes. However, you would find a minor difference. And Glenn and I, and again, love Glenn like a brother. Glenn and I would get there, and we would always be on opposite teams when we were planning operations. Always be on opposite teams when we were planning operations. We would sit down and we would look at that, and we would be screaming at each other about minor differences because each team had to get up and brief. This is our plan of operation. This is how we're going to hit the objective. And Glenn would look at me like, that is the dumbest crap I've ever heard of. That right there is going to get somebody killed. I'm like, you're an idiot. We're going to do this, and this is why I did it this way. And if you had actually been thinking about that, maybe you would have spotted it. Like, this is how we're talking to each other. And then what would end up happening is your team sergeant, your warrant, your team leader, they all get together, they all look at it, you look at the various plans, you're like, all right, we like the infill and exfil strategy from plan A. We like the actions on from plan B. We like, plan C, we like this, and this. This will, and then we would sit there and we'd work out what the plan was and the whole deal. And Glenn and I weren't mad at each other. We weren't upset at each other. We were trying to get the best out of one another. Because each time I came out, each time I had to go present, I knew Glenn was going to look for any flaw in that plan whatsoever. And there was no way he was going to have a better plan than I did. None. No way he was going to have a better plan. No way he was going to shoot better than me at the range. No way he was going to be better than me in the shoot house. And no way he was going to get on the front of the stack when we kicked in a door. I was going to be at the front of the stack. Glenn could be at the back of the stack. In fact, Glenn, go sit up at the 50 cal.
Oh yeah,
wives
love hearing their husbands talk about being at the front of the stack when they're going to kick in a door.
But the whole point was that I could have said that about a lot of the guys on the team. That's just how we operated and what we wanted to do, and we wanted to be the best. But we didn't want to just be the best for us. We wanted to be the best for everybody else on that team that was going to depend upon us in that situation. We were going into something where we wanted everyone to come home. But one of the things I think people need to understand is one of the things you do when you plan a combat operation, you list off how many of you can lose in order to get the guy. I don't think people understand that.
I never knew that.
You list off of how many of you can you lose as long as you get the guy and it's still a successful operation.
No.
Yeah. You do that because in the military, it's mission first. Whenever you have these commanders saying, my goal, our mission is to bring everyone home alive, I always look at those guys like, you're a moron. No, it isn't. If that's your only mission, great, don't leave. Don't go overseas. No, your mission has to be accomplished what it is you were put there to do. And we operate in a dangerous environment, which includes violence, which means we could lose some of us. So you don't use our lives cheaply, but that's still the mission, and we have to be focused on that. And so we better be as good as we possibly can be. But anyway, I didn't mean to get off on this big tangent, but that whole point that he was bringing about men competing with one another in a healthy way, that if you don't understand what the objective is that they're trying to do, it can be easily misconstrued.
I just want to highlight something real quick. Is one of the reasons why I don't respect Tate very much at all. So there's all these clips of him sitting there telling his stories. And so many of them are, we were in the gym and I was trying to lift this much and he was trying to lift that much. But then I regularly get to sit across from the table and hear my husband talk about, you know, kicking in doors and getting bad guys and, you know, running operations, you know, in a war zone. And so it's hard for me to respect somebody like Tate because his stories are about the gym and the fighting ring and everything's so sterile and clean and perfect and none of it's really below the belt. And then I hear somebody talk about running missions and talking about actually possibly dying on a mission to do something bigger, better than yourself, like having a higher goal than yourself. And I feel like that's kind of, that right there sort of encapsulates the disconnect for me, is that Nick tends to look at what is the honorable thing to do for those who are depending on me, and what's the bigger mission here? What is my higher purpose? Whereas, you know, Tate's higher purpose is pretty much whatever's going to get him another Bugatti.
I want to say thank you to Alt Tab Life for donating, and he brings up a good point. He said the best way I found to use the highlights of both the Tates is give an example of what can be achieved with a model. Peterson gives a moral framework to civilize it. That's a really good point. We're going to kind of dive into that some more. We got a couple more Tate ones to go through, and then we're going to get on to Jordan.
I'm going to wait until we're done with Tate.
Nothing to say about what I said at all.
No. Tina, I was going to say something to it, but I feel like that maybe my response to you should be held off until we're done playing the clips with Andrew and his brother, because in some ways I agree with what you said, although I don't necessarily know if I agree with it from the same perspective. So I'm gonna hold my comments to that until we get to the point where we wrap up our thoughts on Andrew Tate, and we're about to move into Jordan Peterson.
All right, so let's go into this next one. This is another Tate.
In the world we live in today, you need to establish credibility, and whether people like it or not, wealth is a way to establish credibility. Like, there's a lot of people who dislike me, and that's fine, but it's hard to deny that I am fiscally successful, at least, and that gives you a degree of credibility.
Yeah, when he talks about that is one of the things that I think kind of distinguishes the way Andrew Tate kind of, there was two things that I think distinguished him right off the bat on giving him credibility with a male audience. One was being a kickboxing champion. The other was money and beautiful women, right? And again, you can look at that all day long and say, well, that's not sufficient credibility. Yes, I agree with you.
You know, however, what the third piece of credibility
it's very tempting credibility for a lot of young men that are looking for something.
Money and beautiful women.
You know what the third piece of credibility was?
What?
What the left did to him.
Yeah.
For a lot of young men, that was a huge piece of credibility.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
It was, oh, these people hate him? Well, then clearly he must be saying something right.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, so this next one. By the way, I want to apologize. We should have let everyone know up front that there was some language in this, obviously, with some of the clips and whatnot. We are going to try to find a better way to try to beep this stuff out in the future. I apologize, but anyway, go ahead.
Only even acknowledge he exists if he's ignored how he feels 99% of the time before that. Because if he was sad most of the time before that, he never would have got to a place where he could attract a woman like you. The man who works in Starbucks, who's sad all the time, you won't reply to him. Neither will any other female. So for women to come along and pretend they give a about the fact that most men are basically invisible. There is not a female on the planet who's invisible today. You can be a 4, overweight, fat, you'll still go to the club and get attention. 99% of the men go to the club and nobody even fucking talks to them. If they try and talk to a girl, they get blanked and ignored and told to most men are absolutely and utterly invisible. This is the truth about masculinity, right? It's very easy for women to sit here and complain about the top 2% of men because I've dealt with this guy, he's arrogant, blah, 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 blah. Most men don't even fucking exist. They send 10,000 DMs and never even get read, let alone replied to. So if you just sit here and say, I'll get a big G, a boss, a millionaire, and let him have a day off, very nice of you. I'm sure you would. But if a guy who wanted to have days off all the time, he never would have got important enough in the first place to attract a woman like you. And that is the reality. As a man, it's player versus player. It's ultimately competitive. And as a man, you have to outcompete the other men who are prepared to get up and do it anyway. That's how it works. There's no such.
Yeah.
Everything he said there encapsulates why so many young men are gravitating towards his message.
Yeah.
Everything he said. I don't think I said this earlier. There's a lot about Andrew Tate that I don't like in the sense that I don't like his business background.
Yeah.
He's very arrogant. And he, I think, pushes this this version of masculinity that is, in fact, here's the part where I'll bring it up. I told Nick when we were planning for this episode, I said, I feel like the best way to describe the divide between Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate, and we're going to get to Peterson later in this episode, is that Jordan Peterson preaches about responsibility. That is his primary message, and that has captivated the attention of millions of people because not a lot of people are talking about that. But Andrew Tate speaks to the desire for revenge. And I feel like that the divide between Tate and Peterson can be described as that. It is the divide between responsibility and revenge or retaliation. And everything he just said there, I mean, encapsulates why so many young men I feel like are gravitating towards him. And if you have a problem with that, I know that everybody in the left has a problem with that, but there's also a lot of people on the right that have a problem with that. If you have a problem with that, regardless of your political affiliation, you probably need to understand why he has the following that he has and why his message resonates with so many people. Because if you think it's a bad message and you think that he's corrupting people or pushing them in the bad direction, you need to understand why people are following him in the first place. I think they're following him in the first place because the first 2 or 3 clips that we played at the beginning of this podcast where we showed the left's message to young men, they're not buying that message at all.
Yeah. No, let's. So I think we got one more for Tate, and then we're going to move on. And I want to address this one before we move on. No. Do we? Are we out then?
Nope.
Go to one more over. One more over. Okay, yeah, go back. All right, the one that we're missing, that we're going to do. So we're about to move on to Peterson, but there was one more where Tate was talking about how, and this is one of his earlier ones, where he was talking about how. Men are not biologically or evolutionary created to have just one woman, right? And we're supposed to have many because the evolutionary imperative for men is to have kids and to reproduce, and so therefore it doesn't make sense for men to have one woman. And he goes, and there'll be guys that disagree with me, but they're like low T, they're not G's, they can't do anything. All the kings, they had their harems, they had their whole deal. And I want to look at Tate at that point. I want to say, dude, I'm going to be honest with you, man. I kind of think that's pathetic, because you're right. The kings had harems. Right, but were a lot of those kings because they had done something significant? No, they were kings because they were born into it. Not to mention the fact, you want to look at the downfall of a lot of famous men throughout history, it's when they started getting caught up with multiple women. I mean, Solomon's a perfect example of this. David's a perfect example of this. I mean, it is...
Alexander's dynasty is a perfect example of that. He had some bastards, and he had a legitimate kid, and he had a lot of other relatives.
Yeah.
And when he died, they all found their favorite general, basically, and fought each other to the death. And his dynasty, which claimed to have traced itself all the way back to Hercules, but in actual recorded history was over 300 years old, that the Argead dynasty had ruled the kingdom of Macedon, went extinct within a generation after his death.
Yeah. Well, and this. We pulled up a clip. Go ahead and play the clip.
There's a societal expectation which has been placed upon humanity, and then we have a biological and evolutionary imperative, and the male evolutionary imperative is not to have one female. Now, there are some dudes out there who are going to disagree with me, but those are dudes, they got low testosterone, they're not the big G, they ain't got no money, they ain't nothing, right? That's different. But any man who's actually in a position of status, since the dawn of human time, every single king, every single sultan, all of them had more than one chick. That's actually the natural human state.
Pause. No, I don't. See, this is the part where, again, this is the part where I look at Tate, I'm like, dude, you lost me, man. You lost me entirely. And again, if you want to say I don't have sufficient status in order to do it, fine. But the point is
that view, like I look at that and go, okay, that view that he is espousing right there is the exact reason why he has so much anger toward women, because the type of women who will stay with somebody who refuses to be monogamous, they are not the type that he says he wants. Like he wants like these like traditional type women, but traditional women are not attracted to men who spread their seed around. They're just not. It completely reminds me of that scene in The King and I when the king is talking about how, men are the bee and they go from flower to flower to flower, and
but the flower never goes.
But the flower never goes from bee to bee to bee. And no, never mind the fact that what really happens is like multiple bees visit each flower. But it's absurd. From a perspective of anybody that wants like whole healthy relationships, it's just absurd. And I think I don't know, it seems like a perversion, and that is the type of thing that skews the rest of what he says now, because he'll talk about how women should live up to these certain standards and things like that, but the type of women he's dabbling in are the ones who don't mind sharing.
Well, and I think that's a huge consideration here. I think the other part is to keep in mind, again, he goes back to this example of you can't give a historical behavior, or you can't give an historical example of bad behavior and then hold it up as an example because it's historical or consistent, right? Just because you might have a predisposition to do something doesn't make that thing good. And one of the biggest issues that I have with the Tates is what is the overline? It's not good enough to do this because I say so and look at my mansion, right? That's not good enough. Do this and I say so because I'm a kickboxing champ. Okay, I'm sorry, not good enough. Not good enough. There needs to be some sort of consistent moral imperative which actually informs these decisions. And the other thing I would say on this is it's real simple. When at some point when you meet the woman that you absolutely want to spend the rest of your life with, and you want to be exclusive to her and she wants to be exclusive to you, that has nothing to do with being a simp. That has nothing to do with being weak. That's a part of that nobility. In every single one of those stories, they all talk about men going out and slaying dragons. They weren't slaying a dragon to go get 5 women. They were going to get the one, right? And that may be a Disney fairy tale version of reality. Fine, whatever. They use the example. And the point is when you do find somebody that is what that means for you, and that's why that commitment is so strong. And quite frankly, you ain't sharing, and neither are they, with anybody else. That's something worth fighting for. That's something worth building a family for, right? If you want to try to replace that, with a bunch of other deficient relationships, because that's what it is. It's a deficient relationship. If you can't find the sufficiency within being with that person, loving that person, committing to that person, and them getting to know that they're the only one, if you can't find that, then you haven't found something yet. And you don't get to lecture me, because I have.
Yeah, I think there's just that component of a deep, meaningful, and rich relationship. Relationship component is missing. It's purely sexual. And the sexual side, of course, is wonderful. But the thing is when everything starts to fade and you're old and you're like 70, 80 years old and you've had somebody that's been by your side and lived life with you and experienced everything with you, I feel like there is this deep, meaningful connection that if you can find it, you need to.
Well, can we say one of the biggest problems, and they understand it to a point, but I still think that they fail on this. And the reason why that monogamous relationship between husband and wife is so important is because the relationship between husband and wife is actually not supposed to be competitive. It's cooperative.
Complementary.
Your relationship with all your guy friends and stuff like that, those are good. They can be quasi-competitive. They can be complementary. They can be all of those things. But there's something unique in that male to female experience because there's aspects and attributes of her and her characteristics and her personality and the way that she looks at things, which completes things in you, and the same thing with you for her when you're actually in a completely loving, trusting, and monogamous relationship that, I'm sorry, he ain't going to replicate with a bunch of women.
And when those monogamous relationships and healthy marriages crumble and collapse, as they have in the West, we should not be terribly surprised that people gravitate towards his message.
No. And that's what it is. It's and again, I think to your point, right, when you said before, I don't know that if I would have worded it the same, but I think I get what you're meaning, and I tend to agree. It's that whole idea of revenge. It's this idea of like, fine, this is the way you want the world to be. Well, then I'll show you what it can be like. Because again, the little girl in the beret at the beginning of this thing is not going to be.
She's not going to beat Andrew Tate.
No.
When the chips are down,
no.
and it's What are you going to bring to the table? Can you beat me? Can you say I'm an oppressor, right? I've got to, and you say that all of civilization and society is built around oppressive power structures. So I've got a question. Can you oppress me?
Yeah.
No, you can't.
Yeah.
But I can oppress you.
That's the scary
that is
part.
the
It's
scary
the dark
part
side of all this.
from a female perspective is that, no female, even if she's armed, is going to be able to defend herself against multiple well-trained men who are bent on going around and oppressing people. If, let's say, apocalypse happens and everything, and you end up with these men that basically like modern day Vikings who go and conquest everything, who are previously militarily trained. I don't care how trained a woman is. With a firearm, you're not defending yourself against 10 guys that show up with firearms as well. And so the idea that like when men have had enough of our crap and women have just bashed and bashed and bashed men and just emasculated men throughout, our modern society, what happens when men have had enough of this crap and now they're going to make women pay? To me, that is a scary thought.
That is toxic masculinity. If there ever was a term,
but the thing is
an appropriate use for that term, that is the appropriate use of the term.
But there will be men who are bent on that.
Yeah, there will.
And they will have become sort of radicalized in order to win the gender war, basically.
We've talked about this in the right-wing backlash episode, that is the dark side of the right. I brought this up earlier in this podcast, and somebody in the comments said there's no such thing as right-wing authoritarianism. Our interpretation of the right, Nick's interpretation, mine, Tina's, Hamilton's, is that we look at the left and the right as a spectrum where the further left you go, the more authoritarian, the more government control, the less personal freedom there is. And so, therefore, we would say 1984, North Korea is the most extreme left-wing scenario that you could possibly get. Zero freedom whatsoever. And then we say the opposite is true on the right, that the right is less government, less tyranny, more personal freedom. So in a theoretical sense, the most extreme right-wing society you could get is actually a state of anarchy, where there's no government. That's one way to look at the left and right. Another way that you can look at the left and right, though, is you can say, there are examples of authoritarianism that span that spectrum and that you can be on the right economically and culturally, but you can want to impose those ideologies on people through force. Yeah. And so you could be free market capitalist, you could be pro-family values, but you want to impose that on people by force. And so there's an element of the right that I feel like that is gravitating towards people like Andrew Tate, and they absolutely encapsulate what you just said there, Tina, where they're getting to a point where they feel like that society, and especially our extremely feminized educational system and other institutions,
where they're treating men like defective women,
have beaten them down so much that eventually they're going to snap and they're going to be like, enough of this BS.
Yeah,
we're sick and tired of you pushing us around. We have the power here, and guess what? We're just going to take it.
Yeah. So what happens when men realize they have that power? Because, I'm of the opinion that there is some severe toxic femininity going on in our society, and even some men are operating in it. Like the dude with the long nails and the whole like men are meant to be submissive thing. This is the thing, is that when you emasculate men long enough, you're creating monsters who are bad monsters. And so what happens when we get to the point where these guys are going to go around and make women pay? Like they're going to put women in their place, whether like as an overcorrect, not putting us in our proper place, but actually like making women pay,
actually oppressing them.
Yeah, for what women legitimately have done. Okay, so I'm not saying that this sentiment is unwarranted. I think it is warranted, and that's why a woman like me gets very concerned about pushing these men so far and emasculating them to this point where they snap. And then at that point, who's going to save us, right? Women have to have men. we have to have another option besides this revenge-seeking men who are seeking revenge. There is always going to be men like Nick, in my opinion, who rise above that and they see themselves as a protector, and they use their what the left would call toxic masculinity, their danger component. They use their danger component to keep the villains at bay, basically. And so when the barbarians are coming and they're going to hurt the women, there will be men like Nick that stand up and defend the women. But I feel like women are in this really precarious position where we have pretty much spent all of our capital that we possibly have. And at some point, men are going to snap.
Well, we got a couple of things. I want to thank some people that donated. We got Trump, sweaty fat guy, man. Thanks, brother. Appreciate that. He goes, finding women willing to stay through everything is nearly impossible today. 30 plus years ago, it was far more prevalent. It's not like when we were kids. And that's been a really common sentiment that we see all the time. I will say this, at the same time that there's a lot of attention going to what we might call like the club girl culture that you see on like Fresh and Fit and whatever podcast and just pearly things and stuff like that. There's also I would argue kind of a push on the other side for the trad wife, the traditional wife. There's a whole culture that's actually coming up with that as well, but you're not going to find any of those girls on those shows. I mean, every once in a while they bring them on as kind of like a counterpoint to the club culture. But yeah, it's there. And then thank you again to Christian Patriot 75. Appreciate it. Stephen Mitchell said, Nick, we all acknowledge the existence of hypergamy or hypergamy. Yeah. I think it's hypergamy, but it's the idea of women having a tendency to try to marry up, to marry people of like a kind of like a higher status with respect to money, with respect to status in general, socially, economically, within society. And again, the idea is that women were looking for, because of the natural dynamics between men and women, women were looking for somebody that could provide and protect. And for a lot of human history, what you saw within the nature of relationships is you saw generally older men marrying younger women because the men had to establish themselves in the world because it was automatically expected that they were going to provide. This is one of the reasons why, too, I think Jordan Peterson has done a good job on this, where everything is talking about like, oh, the patriarchy was all just set up to oppress women. And Jordan Peterson's like, wait a second. What you have he goes, certainly that happened. What you had with most people within society, though, is you actually had men and women struggling together within the marriage, within the family, within the tribe or the community or whatnot.
And within authoritarian oppressive governments. Yeah,
in overwhelmingly difficult circumstances to try to carve out a life. And obviously there's a natural inclination for women to marry men that they think are going to be able to protect and provide. And some people chalk this up to evolution. Some people just chalk it up to historical norms. But one of the things that people have kind of theorized on was this idea that as the gender revolution started, as things like birth control, as other things came out, as there was more, arguably speaking, significantly more peace, significantly more stability. You now had far more industries. I mean, let's face it, for most of civilization, 75% of the workforce, the labor force, had to be involved in agriculture so people didn't starve.
Minimum.
So it was like back-breaking outdoor work that required a great deal of physical strength. Now we have far more complex economies which don't require that. Women are far more competitive within those environments. And so it's this idea of moving away from that kind of traditional arrangement that you saw between a lot of what men were looking for, what women were looking for. Now, by the same token, I do think there's things that are somewhat hardwired into us on what we look for and what we value. And traditionally, all the way up to this point, women still value men that can protect and provide, right? We value beauty, we value purity, we value loyalty, right? These are all things that we value. And what's interesting is more and more, and one of the things that...
Oh, come on. You value cooking.
Well, that's the part of that is that cooperative nature
and providing honey.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the point that I'm making out is that, again, this is not like a comprehensive list of what both men and women prefer. Obviously, women like attractive men. Men like attractive women. But when you score it on the degree of importance between men and women, they tend to answer that question differently. All right. And so these are just things to understand. But what we've been told more and more is that when a woman values something, that's something men have to pay attention to. When a man values something, that's just evidence of the patriarchy, or that's evidence of men being superficial or selfish or whatever it is. And the real question is what is valued? Because what is valued can have positive manifestations and negative manifestations.
Yes.
So for instance, if a man values beauty, which every man I know does, right? The positive manifestation is I appreciate beauty and I love it and I enjoy it. A negative manifestation is when a man can become abusive, or a man can become emotionally abusive to his wife, right? That's
or he commits rape.
Right, yeah. And then
he cheats.
Yeah, exactly. And then what's a positive manifestation for a woman wanting security and well, okay, she looks for a man that is competent, because this is a man that she's going to have children with, presumably, and she wants to know that her and her children are going to be able to be provided for. That is a positive manifestation. What's a negative manifestation? Gold digger.
Yep.
So it's like so many of these other things. We come up with these terms, and then they end up encapsulating the entirety of masculinity or the entire of femininity, when in reality, it's that there are certain traits, there are certain characteristics, certain attributes, certain preferences, which have both positive and negative manifestations. And if you look at them through that lens, you can find where they're complementary. And if you look at them through the other lens, you can find where they're actually destructive, toxic, or competitive.
So this is, I think, a great segue to begin talking about Jordan Peterson.
Yeah,
because
we need to. Gosh dang.
We've
Like
talked
alternate answers.
Look,
yeah.
this is going to be a long episode, but you know what? I'm loving it, and apparently the audience is too. I mean, we have more people watching now than pretty much in any other live stream we've ever done. So I'm not really upset that this is going to be a little bit longer of an episode. In some ways, I think it's quite warranted, because we're talking about some really deep stuff right here. And the reason that I'm so excited to start talking about Jordan Peterson is because we just went through Andrew Tate, right?
Yeah.
We played some videos, we talked him up, but then we also deconstructed him a little bit, and we gave him his due, but we also criticized him.
Yeah.
And it's very funny because a lot of people didn't have the patience apparently to wait for the criticism. Instead, the headlines are going to be, I can't wait until Nick's Democrat opponent is gonna run ads about how Nick Freitas supports Andrew Tate. Like, I can't wait to get those mailers in this district. But you know what? Actually, with that might actually improve Nick's vote with younger men. But no. So like, there's a side of Andrew Tate that appeals to younger men, and again, the way that I described it was this desire for revenge or retribution. But there's another aspect of this that I think is missing, desperately so. And it's that younger men have a yearning for meaning and purpose and responsibility in this world. And Andrew Tate doesn't necessarily speak to that a whole lot, but Jordan Peterson does. And that's why personally, out of the two, I like Peterson more. I also like Peterson more because he's a bit of an academic.
Yeah.
He's a bit of an egghead, and I am too.
Well, let's do this. If we can kind of sum up, because if we could kind of sum up, I would say that what Andrew and Tristan and Justin, some of these other guys are doing is they're essentially saying, look at what we did, and look at the success we've experienced, and that's why what we're talking about works. Now, I don't want to call it totally hedonistic, but I think there's hedonistic elements of it. But I also think, too, that you start to see this with Tate as well. Tate's kind of changed his tune on some stuff over time. You see the same thing with Tristan on some of these things as well.
OPM Vision said this in the comments that, like, I don't necessarily know if it's true to say that Tate and Peterson are completely at odds with each other. In fact, they've said complimentary things about each other to some degree. So,
So Stephen, that is a great point. Please understand, what we'll get in here is we're not. I know, like, you look at.
I mean, Peterson doesn't talk about like using women and discarding them. So,
but I know we kind of set it up as like a versus this versus that, and you're absolutely right. There's actually a lot of aspects of this where there's overlap, where there's complementary notions and concepts. But ultimately, I do think that it's going to be very difficult for these things to, there's going to have to be some correction. All right. So, anyways, let's go and jump into.
I love this clip.
Let's go into Jordan Peterson.
Well, there isn't anything better to have than a problem that's worth solving, like that's really worth solving, right? And so the more of that you take on, the more you have a reason to get out of bed in the morning, no matter what. I think I'm getting up, I'm trudging forward. Doesn't matter what I'm suffering from, I've got things that need to be done. They're necessary. And that gives you that sense of purpose that is the antidote to bitterness.
Pause. So right off the bat,
so much truth.
Gosh
to that.
dang, he's good at
this
explaining
is
this
classic
stuff.
Jordan Peterson right there.
Yeah.
That 20-second clip is why tens of millions of men across all ages, but especially younger men, have just fallen in love with this man and what he's had to say. It almost brings tears to my eyes because, like, Nick, on election night of 2020, that was the most depressing night of my entire life. For those that know the backstory, I had known Nick since high school. Yeah. I had a mutual friend who I think used to be Nick's neighbors, the Lila's family. Yeah. And I was good friends with her. And so I got to meet you the first time through her family. And we had known each other for years. And you know, I was like, Nick, you need to run for office because you have all these things to say. And my whole plan for Nick was get Nick elected to the Virginia legislature, and then when the 7th district congressional seat opens up, we're going to run Nick for it. He's going to get the nomination and we're going to win. And that was the plan. That was the plan literally since 2012 for me. Nick, that wasn't the plan for Nick. That wasn't the
plan for me.
But that was the plan for me. I've got the Facebook messages from over a decade ago of me saying you need to run for office. That was the plan.
Yeah.
And it all led up to 2020. So 8 years of planning. And then election night comes and we lose by like 6,000 votes or something like that.
Yeah, it was
by less than 2%.
Yeah.
And I was crushed. I was, this is going to sound maybe arrogant, but like, I feel like that I was more upset about Nick losing than Nick was upset about Nick losing.
That might be true, actually.
And I felt like that my entire, like here, my thought process was, Nick, you've got a lovely family and kids and a career. You've done things with your life. You went to war multiple times. Nobody's going to question your contribution to civilization or society. And you know what? If the political thing doesn't work out, you've got job opportunities. I was in my 20s, still am. I was like, what, 27 or something like that? Yeah. And 26 or 27. And I was like, my life ended before it even began because I didn't have any of those things. I didn't have a military record. I didn't have any other career. I didn't have any other job prospects. This was it. This was my entire plan that I had spent 8 years since I was 17 planning for, and it failed. And I felt completely lost and aimless. And everything that Peterson just said there spoke to that.
Yeah.
And it just, I don't know how else to describe it other than that. Like, and thank God that in some ways I look back at it now and it's like, thank God that we lost.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
because we wouldn't be having this conversation.
We wouldn't have the podcast.
It's always God has a plan, right? Well, I think that, again, when you look at what Jordan Peterson is saying right there, and you look at, when you compare and contrast, and Steve Mitchell brought this up, I want to see if I can find it. He goes, in the classic story, Tate is the hot-headed warrior and Peterson is the old guy on the council trying to advise caution. What's so funny is
Karen Hamilton says that Tate is Peterson's pool boy.
Oh, God. So, no, let's not do that. I don't think that works out well for either side. No, I think what it is there's some truth to that, right? There's Tate does kind of represent I think some of the warrior spirit and kind of that youthful, rigor, which requires some direction. And then you look at Peterson, and I do see Peterson is kind of like, the way I described it was, he's kind of like that sage, right? He's like the tribal elder that's, advising the young men on, the proper application versus the improper application. And you look at the way that he just explained that, right? Think about the wording that he used. There's nothing better than having a problem worth solving. In a society which it seems so obsessed with removing any problems or burdens, right? Like, my gosh, if you have to work for a living, that's considered, wage slavery. Give me a break, right? This is the sort of society we live in where if you have to endure anything, if someone gets your pronouns wrong, oh my gosh, what a travesty of justice. You're entitled to compensation, recognition. You're stunning and beautiful no matter what you do. You shouldn't have to work for anything. Your very existence and the ability to breathe in and out consecutively is enough. And then what does Jordan Peterson? He goes, no. The problem is what actually provides the purpose and the meaning. And it's like in a world where some people are starting to realize the hard way, there's no getting rid of the problems. The problems exist. This is what Thomas Sowell calls the tragic vision of life. The idea that there's always going to be scarcity. There's always going to be problems. There's always going to be challenges. When you talk about, from a Christian perspective, the fallen world, right? The original sin. Like these are the things that we have to contend with in life. But there is something beautiful to be found in the contention of a noble purpose, of overcoming the challenges associated with that. And so Peterson talks about it in this way that I just think is so inspiring. But again, the difference is that Tate will say something kind of similar, but it's just come off a lot more rough.
Arrogant.
A lot more raw, a lot more arrogant.
Humility in Peterson's delivery. And there's a lot of, intellectualism in his delivery.
Which has almost become a bad word in
He
some
sort of
circles.
pulls it apart and like shows you it piece by piece and makes it really easy to understand. And there's a level of humility in the way he does it. And you can kind of tell also that Peterson is a man who loves very deeply. Whereas you look at somebody like Tate, and I'm like, aside from his brother, I'm not sure he loves anybody. Like he doesn't show that at all. I'm not saying he doesn't have it. I'm just saying it doesn't show. So there's a really big difference in the delivery of these two men. And Peterson tends to be very courteous with others. Like he doesn't insult other people purposefully. He'll tell them the truth, but he's very courteous. But even though he's courteous and even though he comes at this from a completely different perspective, the fact that he is trying to bring men back into masculinity has canceled him as well in Canada.
Yeah. Well, you remember when this whole thing started, the reason why Jordan Peterson, who, by the way, used to work for like the Socialist Party in Canada, right? Like he was not this idea that he was some right-wing nut job or something like that. The whole thing that started off was they were considering changing the law in Canada, I think in Ontario, where they were talking about you were going to be required to use someone's preferred pronouns. And his whole thing was, it's like, I will not comply with compelled speech. And people are like, oh, so you think you should be able to call, minorities, racial slurs? When he's like, there's a big difference from saying you cannot say certain things and telling people that you must say things. He goes, I've spent my entire life trying to figure out what happened in places like Nazi Germany. What happened in places like Stalinist Russia? Why was it that the same people that gave us Bach rounded up people, put them in concentration camps, and butchered them? How is it that you could get guys in the Eisotzen group that had been average, ordinary people, not sociopaths, not psychopaths, average, ordinary people, to go out and execute people and then go home and hug their children at night? How did you do that? And one of the things that he identified was this authoritarian streak where the government felt themselves in a position to compel people. You will say this, you will believe it, you will repeat it, you will do it. And he's like, I will not.
And gave them moral cover to do so as well.
Yes.
That was the other thing too, where the Nazis would get there's a book called Ordinary Men that Peterson references all the time, talking exactly about that. And the whole message is, do these things, but we're going to have the moral responsibility, not you. You have an obligation to do this. It's a twisted form of responsibility that men gravitate towards. If you want to understand why the Nazis were able to pull off the atrocities that they pulled off, it's because they were able to take men's natural inclination to find meaning and responsibility to the world, and they took those things and twisted it for absolute evil.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
And if you want to make sure something like that never happens again, you have got to give men an outlet for them to pursue meaning and purpose and responsibility in a positive way. You can't just say, we don't need you anymore.
Yeah.
That's never going to work.
Well, especially because it's not true.
Well, yeah.
And that is a huge lie that feminism has fed our society today, is that men aren't needed. Are you freaking kidding me?
If you say that, men will burn society down.
Well, that was the old.
But look at who built the society. Like who does all the hard, laborious jobs? Mostly men.
he was. There's an old African proverb that says that if you don't give young men a place in the village, they'll burn it down to feel the warmth. Someone just brought up Ian Turner said Peterson is an academic, Tate comes from the streets, but both are fighters, and that's an interesting thing. So let's get to this next point. Go ahead and play this one.
I would agree with that.
Look at it this way. All right, women are much more likely to try to commit suicide, and men are much more likely to kill themselves. And the reason for that is that men use lethal force and women don't. Now that's a big difference. Okay, so then you say, well, women manifest aggression towards themselves and to others, but they don't use lethal force. They don't use physical force the same way men do. So they have to do it some other way.
Why do they have to do something some other way?
Because
you can
people
take your
are
Hobbesian
aggressive.
War against, so you're basically a Hobbesian. Like
no,
war
I'm half
all
and
against
half,
wall.
half and half. half Hobbes, half Rousseau. That's why I'm not an ideologue. Because I don't think that people are good or evil. I think they're both. I don't think that culture is security or tyranny. I think it's both. And I don't think that nature is benevolence or catastrophe. I think it's both. And that's why I'm not an ideologue.
Pause.
There's so much truth to that.
Yeah. And again, this is one of the things that, going back to Ian's statement earlier, and we've talked about this before. There's I almost compare it to the young kind of hot-headed soldier, right, and the tribal elder. Like, one's lived a little bit more life, one's seen it. Their experiences are a little bit different, but they are seeing some of the same things, and they're going about it differently. And Peterson has put in a great deal, like Tina was saying earlier. One of the things she doesn't like about Tate is that even when he's saying something that she kind of agrees with, it's not precise. The language is sloppy, and it can be easily misinterpreted. Whereas Peterson is incredibly careful in what he says and why he says it and how he delivers it, because he believes that he does not want to be misunderstood. He wants to be precise in his language.
Which is why he does that pause. He will pause and he will slow the conversation down. And I think that's a really good lesson for all of us, because there are times when if we rush to try to say something and respond, we may not give the best response. But if we let things sink in and try to make sure that we are understood. You know, Nick always, I was not very good at communication when we were first married. And I would say something, and maybe I said a few things that could be misinterpreted, but I was just trusting that he just understood what I said. Well, you know me, you know what I meant. And he looks at me and he's like, I am not responsible for what you meant. I'm responsible for what you said. And he's like, I am processing the information you gave me, and I'm responsible for that information. And if I infer something that I know about you onto it, then I'm adding to what you said, basically. And he's like, you need to be, like he told me, I need to be more precise in my language. I agree with that, because people say things in haste that they don't mean. And I think if you give yourself a second, like Jordan Peterson does, you do a much better job of being understood. Because the point of saying something is to be understood.
Well, I think too, when you look at kind of the passion and kind of like the raw, explanations that the Tates give, there's a component of that in masculinity. When you look at the very, very deliberate and very intellectual arguments that Peterson does, it's to go back to the whole soldier and elder, right? It's the idea of action and contemplation. And both of those things are required. You have to have action. If it's nothing more than contemplation, well, this all becomes an academic exercise, and you get railroaded. If you don't have proper contemplation before the action, bad things happen.
You're just a barbarian.
Sometimes very bad things happen.
There's a question. There's actually two things. First, I'm going to ask a question for you, Nick, and then I'm going to mention a story that Jordan Peterson brought up that I think encapsulates this clip that we just watched here. The question is from Dan Christopher, and I think it's a great question. He says, how do you think the approaches of the Tates and Peterson will affect political conservatism and masculinity going forward in an organized political structure?
So
that's a great question.
It really is. I think What If Alt Hist did a good job when he was talking about the upcoming right-wing backlash, and he was saying he came up with 4 categories. Like, one category was what he called like the red pill, and that was like Andrew Tate. One was the Petersonians. One was religious people, and I forget what the fourth one was.
He said that there was the cross, the lobster, the snake, the libertarians.
The libertarians, that's right. Yeah.
And then the frog, the Pepe.
I don't think that's a bad analysis. I think what you're going to see I think what you're already starting to see on the right wing of the political spectrum within the United States. And it is important to make a distinction between the right wing in the United States and other places, because it doesn't always match up as perfectly. But you are seeing this big battle right now between those that believe in the beauty and the greatness of American culture and American institutions, and they want to fight for it, and they want to use the government to fight with it. They want to, again, they're going to protect their allies and they're going to punish their enemies. I think that's more of like the Tate approach to it. Then you have, I would almost say kind of the libertarian and the Petersonian approach, where it's preserving the institutions means you can't use the government in the ways that some people want to in order to get back, right? Like they're tired of being pushed around, and fine, if this is the way the game is played, we're going to play it. Whereas we look at that and like, no, that's a poison pill. You're gonna destroy us all if you do it this way.
You'll destroy the American Republic that way.
Yeah, but the thing is that I go when you look at the cross too, it's this idea of what is the proper application, what's the proper role of government in preserving the things that you love and that you care about, while at the same time maintaining a place for liberty and individual choice. And that is a very, very delicate balancing act that we're seeing really come under assault right now.
Yes.
Where the people that are saying, no, we have to respect the balance. I don't got to respect the balance with respect to our ideologies. I can disagree with you all day long. I can want your ideology to fail. But if I'm willing to use government force in order to achieve it, if I'm willing to determine its failure because I was able to use government force better than you were in order to do it, then I'm creating the monster that will one day be used against me. And there's a lot of people that look at that approach and say, I'm done listening to it. The monster exists. I'm going to control the monster. And our argument goes back to nobody controls the monster.
We're going to use the ring of Sauron to beat Sauron.
The monster controls itself.
No. Their argument, though, is, and this is a very dangerous argument that I'm sure we're going to cover in more depth in the future about like the direction that the right can go, because there's this element of the right that's personified by the Pepe Frog, the Tate faction, but also some elements of the Cross faction too.
Yeah.
That their response is that, look, the side that wants to win will always defeat the side that wants to be left alone.
No, that's the argument. Well, and Catachrome asked this question: is the divide of the Tate-Peterson masculinity divide one that is an actual divide, or is it more of a combination that is needed to have a healthy society? So that's part of what we're getting at right here, is that we think that there's elements of both here which are needed. The question is that, okay, how do we get to the right balance of what we need? Because obviously there's positive. This is the big thing. This is our theme. There's positive and there's negative outworkings of these attributes that we're talking about. And we went over some of the positives of Tate, and we went over some of the negatives of Tate. We've gone over some of the positives of Peterson, and we're going to talk about some of the potential negatives as well.
That leads me to wrap up this clip here. There's if you've ever watched Jordan Peterson's biblical series, there's a part where he gets to the story of Cain and Abel. And it's a beautiful telling of that story, the way that he describes it. And he says that at the end of the day, the reason that this story is in the Bible is because the ancient Jews needed to reinforce this truth to people, that there is a piece of Cain in you, no matter how able you think you are.
Yeah.
And that is so true, because part of the problem that we as conservatives have with the left is that the left views humanity as perfectible, and all that we need is just to give us, the left, more power and money, and then we'll be able to perfect civilization. I mean, that is ultimately like Marx's message there, is that we're going to create the new socialist man, right? The new communist man. You will never create the new anything man. Man is man. Human nurture can change, but human nature is stagnant. Human nature is what it is. And unless you recognize that, and then you create structures of government built around that rather than trying to change that, you're always going to create basically perverse incentives for people to seize power and then use those political forces to inflict misery and suffering on other people. And Peterson understands that. And I think that somebody like Tate might not understand it, and I know that people on the left do not understand that. So that's part of the reason that I appreciate Peterson so much, is because he thinks so deeply about these things, and that's, I think, a huge positive aspect of him.
Yeah. All right, let's go through. I know we got some more to go through, and then
this is going to be a long episode.
Yeah, we still got some more. Right,
honestly, it's going to be worth it.
Please explain to Jordan B. Peterson that there's a difference between freedom of speech and freedom from consequence. Do you agree there's a difference?
Well, certainly there's a difference.
And are you prepared to suffer the consequences that society may deem you need to suffer because of your views?
Yes, I'm prepared to do that.
What does that entail?
Are you open to learning?
Well, hang on.
That's not the question.
Hang on, that wasn't the question.
It's
That's right.
true.
What an obnoxious.
Well, so what am I willing to do? Well, I think that the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal is probably obligated by their own tangled web to bring me in front of it. If they find me, I won't pay it. If they put me in jail, I'll go on a hunger strike. I'm not doing this. And that's that. I'm not using the words that other people require me to use, especially if they're made up by radical left-wing ideologues. Now, if our society comes to some sort of consensus over the next while about how we'll solve the pronoun problem, let's call it, and that becomes part of popular parlance, and it seems to solve the problem properly without sacrificing the distinction between singular and plural, and without requiring me to memorize an impossible list of an indefinite number of pronouns, then I would be willing to reconsider my position. But I'm also partly opposed to this because it's been made mandatory and has the whole weight of the law behind it. It's like, this is a very bad idea. I believe this is a very bad idea. And I believe that the reason this has caused so much noise, tremendous amount of attention on YouTube, is because there are things that are at stake in this discussion, despite its surface nature.
Pause. Yeah, this is he always makes this distinction.
Speech.
It's the compelled speech component. But this is the part where somebody was bringing up that, Tate's kind of the warrior, Peterson's kind of the academic. And the reason why I give Peterson more street cred on being willing to fight is that I do believe the man is willing to, the man's willing to sacrifice. The man's willing to fight. I don't think he goes down without a fight. Now, he ain't swinging the same way Tate's swinging, right? But he doesn't go down without a fight. And one thing in this that just the moment, every time I hear it, because I've listened to this clip a couple of times, but when that snotty little guy, are you willing to learn? Like, oh, brother, are you willing to be taught? Because I will tell you what, if you honestly believe that you have the capacity to compel everyone else to talk the way you want and do what you want, here's my question for you. Who's going to impose that for you? Because it isn't you. You're not going to impose it. You're not going to impose it on Jordan Peterson. You're not going to impose it on me. You're not going to impose it on my family. You're not going to do it. What are you going to rely on? Oh, you're going to rely on men with guns, right? You're going to rely on agents of the government to be able to carry this out. Which ones? The ones you've created in your own image? Because guess what? They're not imposing anything either. And every time I look at these guys, I'm like, do you even have any conception? Do you have any conception of what it would actually require of you to impose the sort of things you're trying to impose right now? This is all puppy dogs and lollipops for you, as long as there's enough men that you have not corrupted into becoming weak and impotent into carrying out and imposing your edicts. But I got news for you. You're destroying those men. Those men are looking for somewhere else to go, and you're not going to have anybody to impose it. You're going to look around one day and you're going to recognize something. You don't have the juice. You ain't going to do it. You better not have gone too far to alienate the people that do have the juice.
I would also say, though, that some of these strong men that have not, that are the type that can go and enforce this type of thing, there's a concern in someone who would just follow orders to go and compel speech like that. Mm-hmm. At that point, they are agents of. Well,
this is the interesting. It's not to say that authoritarian leftism can't find people to fight. The Soviets did. The Chinese have. I mean, it's like, no, left-wing authoritarianism. The problem is that they're doing something they've never done before. Because it used to be that they were all trying to make this about the working class and fighting against the bourgeois, and they could get people. They could convince young men that they had this noble, glorious thing, and that was to bring about and to be the vanguard of the revolution.
They did. That's how Lenin won in Russia.
That's how they did it. Who's the vanguard here? Antifa? Antifa's going to be the vanguard of the...
They're attacking young men now.
Yeah. Antifa's going to be the vanguard of the pronoun revolution? I don't think so.
Lenin pulled off, this revolution against the Tsars. Well, actually, technically, it was a revolution against the Russian Republic. But anyway, point is that the Bolsheviks won in Russia because they had an army of young men that from their point of view, had nothing to lose and everything to gain by joining the Bolsheviks. And so they did so. And they rose up the social ladder by doing so because they toppled the old one. It was like, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. Just swap out the eagle with the red star. But that is not at all what the Western brand of Marxism is selling people at all. They're not co-opting young men, masculine young men that can shoot and fight to stage the revolution. They're attacking young men in trying to create a coalition around attacking young men.
Yeah.
It's always young men that are the problem for everything. That's been the left's message for decades now at this point. That's how they've won elections, is by attacking. They take young men and they attack them for their race or their gender or
their hetero.
Yeah, they're heteronormative. The worst thing to a leftist in the United States today is a 20-something-year-old white cisgender Christian male.
Yeah.
And
the personification.
But unfortunately, there's always going to be people who are willing to just follow orders.
Yeah.
That's the problem, is that there are times when your livelihood or your job or whatever is so important to you that you are willing to enforce unjust laws in order to preserve your livelihood and take care of your family. And there's a point where these things can get so bad that you have to be willing to have the discussion in your head as to, when does this get so bad that I'm willing to sacrifice all of that in order to preserve what's right?
Yeah. All right, let's look at the next clip from Peterson.
One moment.
The first question might be, why should you even bother improving yourself? And I think the answer to that is something like, so you don't suffer any more stupidly than you have to. And maybe so others don't have to either. It's something like that. You know, like there's a real injunction at the bottom of it. It's not some casual self-help doctrine. It's that if you don't organize yourself properly, you'll pay for it, and in a big way, and so will the people around you. Now, and you could say, well, I don't care about that, but that's actually not true. You actually do care about that, because if you're in pain, you will care about it. And so you do care about it, even if it's just that negative way, you know. It's very rare that you can find someone who's in excruciating pain who would ever say, well, it would be no better if I was out of this. It's sort of pain.
This is
That's
another
great.
Yeah, it's another one. Yeah, why should you bother self-improving? Well, because you'll stop suffering, or you'll suffer less stupidly, you know. And it seems so obvious. And there was another interview where he was at, where somebody was asking, kind of like, she was bringing a left-wing perspective, and she's like, okay, that's great. You talk about, you know, you got to improve yourself, but what about these larger issues? What about climate change? And what about the global economy and all these things, and COVID and all these things that you can't pause, you know, with your banal comments about making your bed. And I remember he looked at her, and to Tina's point, he didn't answer the question. He said, well, it's hard to have a civil conversation with somebody that describes your comments as banal. So how about you reform it in the actual form of a question? And that was critical. And that was critical, because it was Jordan Peterson saying, no, you don't get to do a caricature of what I've said. You don't get to set up a straw man, and then I have to pretend like you're asking me an honest question.
I love that he leans into the awkward silence and doesn't let her off the hook.
Yes.
And she's smiling and she's doing all this stuff, and he just peers into her and just waits for her to reformulate it, which she did.
Yeah.
And I feel like that is an establishing dominance exchange right there. She was trying to establish dominance over him by belittling something that he says, and then he didn't let her do that, and he reestablished his dominance in the conversation and forced her to reformulate it.
When then he gave an excellent response. He was saying the whole purpose of coming up with tasks that people can do to actually engage in self-improvement, to become more capable, to become more competent. He goes, those are the people that you're then going to put into positions of authority to be able to make good decisions with respect to what civilization should do about a particular problem that's bigger than any one individual can handle. And you look at that, and it's like, that makes such perfect sense. And the opposite of it would be like, okay, miss, well, what do you recommend? Do you recommend a bunch of incapable, incompetent people that don't know how to make their bed, make massive decisions that are going to affect hundreds of millions of people? Do you think they'll come up with good solutions? This has always been the question that I've had for the left, where it's this constant idea and drumbeat of, well, gosh, these problems are just so big. We've got to act collectively. We've got to do this. We've got to do that. It's like, wait a second. If you can't trust an individual with the freedom and liberty over their own life, how do you trust a select group of individuals with control over millions of people? Do they come from a different gene pool than the rest of us? Or as Bastiat said, are they made from finer clay? So I want to thank you very much too for person for the donation, man. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, Sandring was singing your praises there, of saying that you give him hope that the Republican Party isn't a lost cause.
Well, so here's the part where we're going to transition now. I know we didn't do as many clips from Jordan Peterson, but what we've been talking about, because I want to get into a lot of the great questions we've been asked, and it is like the terms that we were using earlier have been kind of, the audience has helped us kind of really flesh this out, where it's like you've got, again, kind of the young, hot-headed, soldier warrior figure that is frustrated, is angry, but has experienced problems, experienced challenges, overcome them, and has a view of the world based around this idea of achieving competence and capability and overcoming challenges, and then achieving success as a result of those things. But the success sometimes he talks about is what I take issue with, because I don't view everything he's talking about as the pinnacle necessarily of success. There has to be something more noble than just the big house, or in his case, the harem, right? All kinds of beautiful women. That there's something incomplete with that. And you're starting to see him coming around that too. That's the reason why he's become more theological, I think, in his worldview. And the way he described it was, he goes, when you've seen evil, there has to be good. There has to be something that contrasts that evil that exists in the world. And Tristan, I think, used to claim to be a Christian. I don't know if he still does. And then you see Jordan Peterson, right? Jordan Peterson provides that intellectual framework. I heard somebody said a moral framework, and I think that's interesting, because I do think he's creating a moral framework, but the question I always go back to is from where? From where is he creating that moral framework? Now, I would say Tate is largely making an argument from his personal experience. I was at this stage of life, and then I fought and I achieved this, and then I fought and I achieved this, and then I fought and I achieved this, and now people want to take it away from me. They want to cancel me, and I'm not going to let them do it. I'm going to fight for what I've earned, right? Even if we don't always agree with the way he's earned some of it, or the way he manifests what success would look like. Jordan Peterson has looked at this from the perspective of really going in and trying to understand what has motivated human beings to do both good and horrible things. What have been the incentive structures? What have been the philosophies that have actually pushed it? What have been the policies which have incentivized both good behavior and stuff that is absolutely atrocious, like literally atrocities?
And how do you avoid those things?
And how do you avoid it? And not only that, but how do you steel yourself? This is one of the most important things that Jordan Peterson does that I think is sometimes lost on people that take more of a collective worldview. Because if you're constantly trying to get your morals from the herd, right, you're going to run into problems. And Peterson is trying to find, no, what is that theme? What is that thread that you can use? What are the things that you can recognize about yourself, your own flaws in yourself, the challenges about humanity, and then look at it from the perspective of, how do I make sure that I am never the person that will round the people up and take them to the concentration camps? Because that's the part that he always says. He goes, everyone loves to sit in a safe college campus and think, of course, I wouldn't have been the person to do that. And what he reminds them is, no, you probably would have, unless you've actually done the work to understand what it looks like, why it's done, and that, yes, it could be you unless you prepare yourself to be able to fight against it.
We already saw a lot of that confirmed during COVID, where people were turning in their neighbors for having a birthday party in Canada, where he's from. And there's this lady that's celebrating her 87th birthday, and her family has come to do a birthday party with her. And the police come and drag everybody out. And because their neighbors called and said they had a gathering of more than a certain number of people. And that's not an isolated event. It was happening all over the place. The masking, the vaxxing, all this stuff, turning people in for having too many people at their house. Are you kidding me?
Well,
you would have turned in Anne Frank.
I remember, I will never ever forget a majority of Democrats saying that they wanted to throw people in prison for opposing the vaccine, and that they wanted to confine the unvaccinated to their homes. I will never forget that for the rest of my life.
Yep.
I want to thank Jim Ross too for donation. He goes, the people who are persecuting Peterson do so in the belief that they have a moral authority to demand he comply with their edicts. These individuals count on the state to enforce their edicts, but only against others. Oh, it's absolutely true. It is absolutely true. And think about it. This is where we come down to, where's the problem in this complementary, and is there something missing? Because someone right off the bat, I think, kind of predicted where we were going with this, is that there's elements to the personality traits and the experiences and whatnot that Andrew and Tristan are talking about, that you see in other people recognized as well, that are positive manifestations of what they're talking about: overcoming challenges, taking responsibility, being a man, right? And then there's negative there's negative consequences too. It's the idea of, making wealth regardless of the moral implications of what you're doing in order to make that wealth, right? Treating women a certain way regardless of the moral implications of what it means to actually treat women that way. So there's points in there where are positive manifestations and negative manifestations, but ultimately there's something there that's necessary. And that is, I think that's the warrior. The warrior is necessary. Then you have Jordan Peterson. Again, I still look at Jordan Peterson as the elder. He's still, just because he's not a warrior doesn't mean he's not brave, right? That's really important to understand. Not everyone in society. Now, I believe that every man should be capable of some ability to fight, to defend. And I think Jordan Peterson is. I think he is. I think he's dealt with some health issues and whatnot, but that's a man who uses discipline in order to make himself better and more competent. And he also recognizes that a man cannot just be physically strong. He has to be intellectually strong as well. And I think that's a very important component. The thing that I think is missing for this, and some of this is my faith, right? Again, I'm a Christian. That's the foundation of my worldview. The question of all of this, when we talk about concepts of evil versus good, of morality versus objective morality, people can come up with any sort of moral codes that they want. The question is why should I believe it? And ultimately, this comes down to a question of truth. And so more of the people that I'm looking at within this realm are people like Victor Marx. It's people like John Lovell from Warrior Poets Society. So why do I have such immense respect for Victor Marx? Well, if you haven't seen Sound of Freedom yet, Sound of Freedom is about the story of Tim Ballard.
The good Marx.
Yeah. Victor does the same sort of work. And Victor does that work having coming out of a very, very tragic upbringing of his own. He had to endure quite a lot. He had demons he had to contend with. And through his faith and through his relationship with his wife and whatnot, he not only has fought against that, but now he goes out and seeks to liberate other people that are also captured by it. Right? I look at guys like John Lovell. John Lovell, multiple combat tours, Ranger Battalion, strong husband, strong father, strong man of faith. And so why do I think that faith component is so important? Well, because neither Jordan Peterson or Tate started there, but you see them getting more and closer and closer and closer to it. Because if you're actually looking for something that provides an objective morality, an objective reason, a bedrock for truth, I don't think you can just find it.
Where does it
in
come
a purely
from?
Secular world.
I mean, that's why Peterson, the best way to describe Peterson, I feel like at this point, is a lapsed atheist.
I think he's a deist.
Or even a lapsed agnostic. He probably is a deist at this point.
He is a deist. He says he believes in God.
And I feel like that part of the reason why is because, well, one thing, if you look at the direction that hardcore nihilism and materialism has pushed society, it's a huge contributing factor to a lot of the things that Peterson is complaining about, and rightfully so. So I feel like that's given him the insight, plus his deep philosophical and psychological investigations into the writings of the Old Testament.
Yeah,
has demonstrated to him that I don't think that Peterson is convinced that, a bunch of, Iron Age, Jews in the middle of Palestine, were able to write all of these incredible stories about all of these real psychological phenomenon from just their own figment of their own imagination.
Yeah, they didn't just make it up.
And I think that Peterson is coming to the conclusion that a lot of these things were given to them, not necessarily that they just came up with them on a whim. If you actually dig into the complexity, the psychological complexity of the Old Testament, especially the book of Genesis, there's one way that you can read it, and you could just read it as words on paper. But then when you actually dig into what do these things mean, again, think of Cain and Abel as a story.
Yeah,
somebody like Peterson, I think, is coming to the conclusion that these things had to have been delivered to the Jews through something greater than just themselves.
Well, he was in a debate with somebody about, or not even a debate, but it was a conversation. They were asking about the necessity of God, and he was saying that, well, by definition, whatever is at the foundation of everything you believe is God. It's the thing you use as God. But I guess what I'm offering up here is the reason why I'm looking to certain people as being standard bearers, which have that warrior component, but also have that intellectual component, but also provide the moral, the objective morality and objective truth.
Well, they recognize where that comes from.
It's the idea that there is a standard beyond us, which is not subject to us. Like we've talked about this before in marriage when I was explaining to somebody like, what do you mean? What do you mean the man is the head of the household? Why does there have to be a head? And so I asked the question, when you got married, did you say till death do us part? Yes. Did you mean it? Well, yes. What happens when you disagree? What happens when you disagree? Somebody has to be responsible for the burden of making the decision and accepting the consequences. And one of the things that I find really interesting, because a lot of what we're talking about here is not just masculinity, it's the role of leadership that men are supposed to play within society. And so what sort of leader are you going to be? Are you going to be the warrior without the intellectual component? Well, you're the barbarian. Are you going to be the intellectual without the warrior component? Well, now, this is a great academic exercise, but how do you keep the barbarians on the other side of the gate?
Somebody earlier in the comments said that the best way that I could describe it is that Andrew Tate is Alexander the Great and Jordan Peterson is Aristotle. And if that's true, then we need a John the Baptist, right?
Well, I would argue what we need is Jesus, but what this comes down to, though, is it's this idea that the reason why, again, my faith factors in so heavily into how I look at the concept of masculinity is because my masculinity is not just John Wayne, right? It sure as heck isn't James Bond. Both of them had positive attributes of masculinity, which made them so appealing to men in general. But ultimately, if we're looking for examples, what do I look for? What do I look for as representations of masculinity? I do look for Christ because it was the intellectual component. It was, people always talk too, and we've made up this fictional Jesus now too that was just, Jesus just loved everybody. And Jesus was also about justice. When Jesus went into the temple, think about that for a second. The most important, not only religious but political institution within the Jewish state at the time, went in there with a whip and started kicking people out.
Upturning tables.
Not to mention the fact that if you ever have this kind of like Precious Moments Bible version of Jesus, you haven't read Revelations yet. Right? So all I would say is that what I'm looking for is that, again, the physical warrior is necessary. It is needed. It is essential. It has to be there. That keeps the barbarians on the other side of the gates. Right? The intellectual has to be there. You have to be able to understand, to explain, to train, to educate, to raise up future people to be able to do it when you are gone. But there has to also be that moral component, which is not subject exclusively to us. We don't get to just step in and say, no, I've decided that because of majority rules that this no longer applies. Or I've decided because I have the power, this no longer applies.
We had a democratic election.
Yeah. And this is the part too where I also go to is what does it mean? What does it mean to be a man within that component of Scripture? What does it mean? It means that I have to be noble. It's not good enough for me to be strong. I have to be noble. It's not good enough for me to just be I have to be intelligent. I have to be willing to fight. I have to believe in things more important to myself. Things have to be more dear to me than my own safety and my own comfort. And these things are personified both in your faith, but then you also have these physical manifestations of it. My wife, my children, right? It's that moral code that transcends everything else that we're talking about that is good and is necessary, but is ultimately dependent upon something else. And that's the transcendent. And I think that Peterson and Tate are both looking for that. They're trying to anchor those things to something that they know is transcendent, but they want it to be true. They want it to be true. That's why Peterson is so cautious. He doesn't want to believe a lie. He is absolutely dedicated to not believing lies, to not repeating lies. And he wants to know it's true before he can commit to it. And I can have respect for that. But ultimately, I think the way that what I'm looking for more in society right now is that there needs to be more people that combine the warrior, combine the intellectual, combine the moral, that combines all of that in order to provide an example a modern day example. We have historical examples of it, but provides that and lives up to it with the understanding that we can't achieve that level of perfection.
You want to fuse to use the reference again. It sounds like that you want to fuse the frog, the cross, the snake, all together, right? I mean, because
there's so many
and
people
the lobster
that don't have a clue what you're talking about.
Okay,
right now.
so the reference, we actually brought this up earlier in this podcast, but we also brought it up when we did the right-wing backlash video. We did mention earlier in this podcast, though, that Peterson represents the lobster, and the reason that he used the lobster is because he wrote about it in his book,
yeah.
right? And Tate represents the frog, the Pepe frog, which is the and if you know what that is, you know what that is. I don't need to explain it to you. But and then there's also the cross, which is the religious evangelical conservatism.
Yeah.
And then there's the snake, which, I mean, we're pretty much all snakes, and that category. Although I would argue you can be multiple, you don't need to be one of these things, right?
Yeah.
And so Peterson is offering one brand of conservatism and also masculinity. Tate is offering another brand, arguably conservatism, but certainly of masculinity. And you're here pointing out that, look, there's good and bad things from both of them. You can certainly argue there's bad things from Tate, but there are objectively things, there's a reason that people are following him.
There are nuggets there.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you can do the same thing with Jordan Peterson. There's a lot of things about Jordan Peterson that I don't agree with, but there's also a lot about Jordan Peterson. I really respect him a lot.
I do too.
There's very few people that I will listen to a 3-hour podcast that's not our own. And it's Jordan Peterson when he does his interviews of people and he deconstructs some of these things philosophically. Yeah. And what you're saying here, Nick, correct me if I'm wrong, is that there needs to be a third way that fuses the positive aspects from both of those, but also provides an objective, positive moral framework behind it to not just, be a strong man physically and be a strong man intellectually and be able to stand on those two points, but also understand why you're standing there. And that's where that moral framework comes from.
And that's where you encounter the God problem.
This is,
everybody
I think,
encounters the God problem.
Part of the reason why Peterson is no longer an atheist. And this is also, let's be honest, part of the reason why Andrew Tate converted to Islam. Are you actually surprised that Andrew Tate converted to Islam?
Not especially. Not especially.
Am I right there with describing that what we need is that third way, or is that the position that you're taking?
No, it's the idea that I think we've already had a model for this. Again, I think we've had a model for this since Christ. The difference is that for the first time in our lifetimes in the United States, we're living in a post-Christian country, not to mention the fact that we've had a lot of people that claim to be Christians that also claim to be strong men that were neither. And I do think we have this popular I do think we have this popular manifestation of these things. I know
somebody in the comments, I'm proven right. Yeah. I brought this up. Okay. The Fubar Freak 5. I brought this up at the very beginning before we started recording today. This person, by the way, wrote for audience listeners, bad phrasing with third way.
Yeah.
Okay, so I brought this up and I'm like, somebody's going to bring up, so you're suggesting Mussolini.
Yeah, that's definitely not what
that's
we mean.
Not what we're saying at all.
That was Christian's ADD
but thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, we'll come up with something. We'll come up with a different way to put it. I would say it's an alternative which recognizes the benefits and the values of the positive aspects of what they're trying to say and what they're trying to do, and the recognition and the necessity for it within society. But what we need is what they call in Bible anyways is servant leadership. So again, if you share my theology with respect to Christianity, this probably all makes sense. If you don't, well then okay, let me put it in these terms. It's the idea that the capabilities that you have are for a purpose, and part of that purpose is to help you. Part of that purpose is for you. Part of that purpose is for others. Part of that purpose is to glorify God in your actions. Right? But it's this idea that you do have a purpose to serve, and what's so amazing about that is that this idea or this notion, which is rather unique in Christian theology, is the idea that God actually came and he served.
It's the Logos,
right?
It's the Logos in human form.
It's the idea that you are serving something that again that is noble and that is just and that is good and that is righteous. And one of the one of the problems that I see with when Tate talks about some of these things, and he's so flippant about this idea that, well, if you're not the sort of guy that has multiple women, that's just because you're low T, or you're not capable, or you're not powerful, you're not a real G, and all that. What's righteous about that? It's not righteous. I don't think men are just looking for success, financial and sexual success. Are those things nice to have? Absolutely, provided that they are properly defined and earned. Right? But it isn't sufficient. We know it isn't sufficient. Because people are on their deathbed talking, they're not talking about how they wish they had more money or they wish they had more sex. They're talking about how they wish they had more time with the things that were actually meaningful to them and gave them purpose. And I do believe that that is a desire, not just for success, but for this element of genuine righteousness in feeling the nobility in something that you're doing. And we are seeing more people that are standing, again, when I talk about Victor Marx, when I talk about guys like John Lovell, when you talk about guys like the story of Tim Ballard, the reason why that's beating out Indiana Jones right now is not just because Indiana Jones has become a woke mess where they're destroying beloved characters that we had, but because ultimately that's fiction and Tim Ballard isn't. That's a real dragon that needs to be slayed. And I didn't talk about that in past tense, did I? No. It's a real dragon that needs to be slayed. And Tim Ballard stood up at a particular moment because, not only because he had a capability, not only because he was formidable intellectually and physically to be able to do this, but because there was a moral code that was somewhere beyond himself that informed him that a child of God is not to be sold into slavery, into sex trafficking. And that he had an opportunity and a responsibility to step in and intervene in that moment, even though it cost him something, and it could have potentially cost him everything. Now you go back and you ask him later if what he really wanted in life, if he would trade any of that experience on what he did in pulling children out of that mess, what Bugatti would he trade that for? He won it because there is a sense of desire for nobility and righteousness that has been built into us. And any sort of version of masculinity, which ultimately doesn't point back to that, will always be manipulated for the worst manifestations possible. Always. It will be a quest for pleasure. It will be a quest for power, when really what we desire innately is a quest ultimately for righteousness. Genuine righteousness, not self-righteousness. It's that nobility that comes from actually serving a purpose which is larger than ourselves, but it's also a part of us.
I mean, that's where the crisis of meaning comes in for so many men, not just men, but people in the modern world, is that, material goods are very fleeting. The Bugatti isn't going to mean anything on your deathbed, right? But a family will. And in some ways the immaterial is worth infinitely more than any sort of, physical worldly treasures or goods or anything like that. And I think that part of the problem has been in our postmodern society that we've rejected the idea that those things even exist, let alone that they have any value.
Yeah.
And then what do you get about that? From that, you get the breakdown of the family, you get the breakdown of the church, you also get the breakdown of just all the other tenets that hold up civil society. And this is also why there's a complete collapse in trust for institutions. And people are going to try to fill that void of meaning some way. They're either going to fill that void in the form of, woke cultural Western Marxism, or they're going to fill that void in the emerging, I think, proto-authoritarianism that you're seeing in certain elements of the right. They're not quite there yet. They don't have a majority that, let alone have actually done anything with it. But unless that gets addressed, that's going to become a bigger and bigger problem. And again, unless you can provide a positive form of meaning and purpose to people's lives, they're going to keep gravitating towards these pseudo-religious, almost political cults.
Yeah.
And
well, and we already had.
It's going to end really poorly. I'll just end it like that. I mean, you know the direction that we're heading, and it's a terrible direction.
Yeah. Well, I think, who was it? It was Stephen Mitchell said it's why the left is so powerful. It's why the left is powerful. Non-secular religion. It's this idea that they didn't get rid of religion. They just created one. I think that's what he was saying there. But
no, it's true.
No, I think. Look, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up because I think we went after everything that we were trying to go for on this. But
let me jump in right quick.
Yeah.
When I was growing up, I had the pleasure of having a great friend group, and two of the dads of the sons that I was friends with were very, very high performers in life. And one of them was a crew chief in NASCAR and a crew chief for a lot of different teams and was very, very successful. And about 7 or 8 years ago, I sat down with him one day and I asked him, what makes you so driven? Why do you keep performing at this, peak for so long? And I expected to get an answer from him, but instead of getting an answer, he just got angry that I had asked him that question. And he was disappointed that my generation even had to ask that question of why he had such a drive or where it came from. And I had asked another dad who was very successful as a human resources director in New York City, and I asked him the same question, and he said it was for his family, to provide a good life for his family, make sure they had what they needed. But I think the one thing that's really interesting for me is it wasn't until Peterson and Tate came around that I understood why that first dad got angry. Mm-hmm. Because when Peterson and Tate came and started speaking to young men, it gave them the information that they needed, that drive and that willingness to succeed and push forward shouldn't be questioned. It is what we do. Mm-hmm. It is what we have to do, is what we must do, and there is no other option. And so I'm not sure if the previous generation failed to tell us that, but I know that my dad lived that out and showed that to me. And so I think that, you can hate Tate, you can, not agree with Peterson, but they serve a purpose in this debate. And so I think what we're essentially getting at is that even though they may solve a problem here on Earth, they do not solve the ultimate problem. And that success and even a family here on Earth is fulfilling as it can be, but eternally it isn't. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're saying is missing from both of these men. Would you say that's right?
I think that's definitely a component to it. I mean, basically, I want to thank our audience. They had some great insight throughout this, and I think we're going through this process as well. I mean, we've thought about this, we've watched through things, we've read through things, we've considered it. But I always appreciate when the audience chimes in and is offering their insight as well, because I do think that we've got some categories here that we can actually work with in the future. And it is the idea of, I don't know if, again, we've used a couple of different terms. We said the tribal elder, we've said the soldier. I don't know if we want to say the soldier, the scholar, and what are we looking for? Are we looking for a merging of the two, but also with something that has that clear commitment to an objective moral law and an objective moral law giver that can actually provide that transcendent component of what we're looking here? Because ultimately, if success is just going to be defined by how much wealth you have, as a man, again, this whole thing is about masculinity. If success as a man is going to be driven exclusively by how much wealth you have and how many women you can sleep with, I think that's a very, very hedonistic way to look at the world, and it's going to be one that ultimately leaves you completely empty.
That'll be just as toxic as the left's message about masculinity right now.
Because I heard one person put it this way. He goes, you don't reach the ultimate depression when you're in the depths of poverty or conflict. You reach the depths of depression when you have finally achieved everything you thought your life was meant to achieve and find out it's hollow. Find out that it wasn't sufficient. Find out the thing that you put up on a pedestal was actually insufficient to be worthy of the effort and direction and focus that you gave it within your life. And I think there's something to that. On the other side, it's not good enough to simply be able to, no pun intended, make the argument. You have to be, as men, we better start looking at that you're going to go through phases in your life where you're going to be the person on the front line that is not only responsible intellectually, but is also responsible physically. Because there are physical dangers out there. And as much as we like to look at civilization as a whole, and it has been safer, more prosperous, and softer than it probably has been at any point in human history. But there is a very, very thin layer of civilization covering up a whole bunch of chaos. And if men are not mentally and physically prepared to be able to deal with that, especially to deal with those who would cross those lines and engage in the sort of actions that require a physical response, then in some way you are failing on a fundamental level as a man. And then as you get older, your responsibility is to mentor other men to be able to take that place. I think part of what we're seeing right now here with Jordan and with Andrew as well is we're seeing the young man and the older man. And it's the idea of that role that is supposed to be played in society where the older men who have slain dragons teach the younger ones how to do it, but how to do it properly and with understanding that you don't slay the dragons to get to the hoard of gold. You slay the dragons to protect the things that you love.
You also don't slay the dragons in order to become one yourself.
Yeah.
That is the thing that, and Nick, you and I have talked about this a lot. That's the thing that terrifies me for the future, is that I see all these men that rightfully so are just fed up and have totally rejected the left's message about masculinity. Men need to be submissive. No. But men don't need to be oppressive.
No.
And that is the danger that I feel like that you get that overcorrection that Tina was talking about a couple hours ago. And so I totally think that what we need is, maybe it's because I love Greek philosophy so much, but I'm going to say like what we need is the philosopher kings, right? The men that are willing to use power and force when necessary, but also have the knowledge and foresight to restrain themselves and be dangerous, as Jordan Peterson says, but not dangerous in the sense that you're oppressive, dangerous in the sense that you're dangerous towards those that would be oppressive.
You have to be dangerous to the right people.
Yes.
And things.
And that's ultimately what I think, that's ultimately the component that I think is missing from both Tate and Peterson. If you're going to tell someone to be powerful, you're going to tell them to be formidable, and you're also going to tell them, as again, that it's not enough to just be wealthy, it's not enough to just be successful in some of these concepts, that you better give them a reason why. And the reason why, I think, ultimately has to rest with, because it's true. It's true to do these things for noble purposes. Well, then who's the author of truth? Well, I have that answer in my life. I have that answer. One of the... It's interesting. I think it's in the book of Luke, where Christ is standing before Pontius Pilate, and Pontius Pilate is asking him who he is. And he says, "Are you king of the Jews?" And he goes, he basically said, "Do you believe this, or did someone else tell you this?" And he goes, "Am I a Jew?" And then he says, "For this reason I was born, for this reason I have come, and that is to preach the truth. Those who are on the side of truth, listen to me." Pontius Pilate says, "What is truth?" And then he walked away before Christ answered. And it's interesting because, again, I know what's true. And that gives you the capability to be able, hopefully, it should, when properly applied, that's what gives you the capability to slay the dragons for the right purposes and not to become the dragon yourself. All right. Well, thank you all very much. Stephen Mitchell, again, thank you for coming in. Really appreciate everybody. I think this was a great conversation. Loved this episode. Also, we're looking potentially in the future to try to bring on some other guests to maybe talk about this and elaborate a little bit more, because I think this is a conversation that we're going to be having. But more than that, I think there's going to be decisions that men are going to have to make, and it is just the I don't know if you want to call it the law of masculine society or whatnot, but all of us look up for mentors. We look up for worthy mentors. And I do think that there's some people out there that are standing up and they're actually filling that role. And they haven't reached the prominence yet that some of the other people have, but I think it's going to be necessary for them to do so. And I think some of them are there and they're willing. Again, I mentioned guys like Victor Marx. I think Tim Ballard's, from everything I've seen, a great example of this. I think guys like John Lovell. I think there's other guys too that I know of, that I work in certain circles with, that I think are going to start coming to the forefront, and you're going to see an answer which respects what Peterson brings to the table and respects elements of what Tate brings to the table, but also understands that if it is not ultimately rooted in something true, then all of those things will inevitably go toward the bad manifestations rather than the positive and noble ones. All right. Thank you very much for joining us. We know this was a long episode, 2 hours and 40 minutes, but we had a great time. We really appreciate all of your contributions. Again, please consider joining on Circle. We get a lot of the recommendations for the shows that we do come from our group in Circle. We also have a lot of other things that we do on there. We have a 90-day challenge that we're currently working on, and people give updates about what they're doing. And it's all part about, again, finding ways that you're going to improve yourself spiritually, physically, emotionally, intellectually, how to be, again, better spouses, better people. And again, I think it's just been an incredible experience. So once again, thank you all very much, and we will see you next episode.